Welcome to this quote-unquote complete commentary of Against the Storm, where once again it's not going to actually be a complete commentary on the game, because the game doesn't really have a finite amount of content, because it's procedurally generated. Well, we'll go through that. We're going to look at enough of the game that I can say all the things I want to say, show off various things, explain it in enough detail, and then come away feeling like we got the full experience of understanding Against the Storm and understanding specifically what I did on my adventure through Against the Storm and all the discoveries I made along the way. So to begin with, let's do the classic test. If you haven't played Against the Storm and you're looking at it right now, can you tell what kind of game this is? And this is a case where I ask that question just to be facetious because you can't. This is a game that is a little bit different to how it appears at first glance. You might think it's more of a city builder by the looks of things. We're setting up some economic production chains here, meeting some targets it's giving us. Well, this is more of a background mechanic to the real mechanic that I wish to argue is in the game. It's a strategy game in disguise, because it's not your ordinary city builder. Virtually everything in the game is randomized. So there's a massive amount of RNG. However, the game is designed such that the RNG is watered down to a large extent to make it a bit more strategic, as we'll see as we go along. So we're here in the tutorial for this first footage, and the tutorial doesn't necessarily give you that idea. I came into this game blind. I just picked it out of my backlog and played it based exclusively on the title with no information whatsoever. And after playing the tutorial, I thought, well, it's what I expect it to be. It's some sort of city builder, but I guess it's going to be randomly generated maps, and the challenge is building up and using the map to do something or other, to progress something or other. So that's about the idea I had in the tutorial. There's one big thing the tutorial doesn't tell you, perhaps the defining feature of the game isn't included. Very interesting decision there. They do actually say in the early access notes they're going to upgrade the tutorial, so I suppose we can't complain too much about it, but we're soon going to discover the truth of the game. We come out of the tutorial into a world map screen. We'll look at the world map more later, but by now the game had revealed one of its central conceits, that it is a roguelike. So you build towns and delete them over and over again in order to progress something or other. Although I'll argue much later it doesn't actually progress much of anything. Mainly the game is just for the game's sake. It's like a puzzle game. You just build a town because you can, and there are some in-game reasons to do it, but not necessarily very many. Well, we'll come back to that. Here I am starting my town on the map. You begin with a randomly generated map, you've got a couple of buildings and a small amount of space to build in, and a lot of the game is spent cutting down the trees to unlock more space and get to the clouded areas which have open spaces with things to find in them as well. But here's what it just hits you with, and this is me live getting hit with this for the first time. I discover that the building pool is randomly generated as well. And I was like, well, that's extremely interesting, extremely unexpected, and I suppose at first very unappreciated, because you come out of the tutorial which presents the building tree as a linear system, the normal system where you just get each stage in the production chain and put them down as you have the possibility to do so. Here it's more random, so you essentially have a deck of cards somewhere, not necessarily shown, which is all of the buildings that you own. And you spend points to bring a card out and let you use it in the map, so to speak. So here, I'm picking a couple of buildings. We're grabbing the brewery. I'm going to grab the bakery here as well, because these are things that were mentioned in the tutorial. They're the only information I have, really. I'm like, well, I'll take those because it told me to do something with them just a second ago. And here I am discovering that I've made a terrible mistake. Because if you take buildings where you don't have the beginning of the production chain for them, here I am discovering it's not there in the menu. I was like, why can't I build a farm? The tutorial was like, and now build a farm, and you just did it. But here, once you hit the main game, being able to build a farm is an unlockable ability that comes through the RNG building roster. So because we didn't get it, and I did take things that require you to have farms, we're just screwed. So I've wasted my choices there. Now we'll sit back and wait, because later, as you complete objectives and get happiness scores up, you'll unlock more buildings, you'll get more chances to draw cards from the pool, and you might get the ones earlier in the production chain, essentially, so I still have hope in this situation. But I was just surprised that that mechanic was there and that it wasn't mentioned until now. This is a game where you need to be moderately good at the game in the first stage, so the very first level you play, you'll need some ability to be able to do anything. In particular, you'll need the ability to know all of the different production chains in the game and what the buildings do, Because being asked to make a decision like this one here, should I take the Weaver? I have absolutely no idea, of course, as a new player. But because the game is a roguelike, the first stage might not actually be the first stage. This is a game based around starting the game again over and over, so the first stage needs to be tailored to somebody who's played the game 100 times before. So I suppose because of that, they don't tutorialize very much. They just presume you know what you're doing because all of the playtesters in Early Access knew what they were doing, that sort of thing. So here I am just being given these random decisions as far as I'm concerned. I have no information to make this decision. Can I use the Weaver? What are these icons? What's a training gear? Does it matter that I need to unlock the ability to make training gear? Could I even make it? The answer is probably no in this situation. And I suppose I was just sort of floundering in this first stage, not knowing what I was supposed to be doing the entire time. It's a game where you can learn the production chains over time, and you get used to it, and later, beginning stages and beginning of the game becomes very easy, which is probably the position that this is designed from. But I found the beginning to be very interesting, at least, very surprising, and it felt like I was being given something by the tutorial and then it was taken away by the time I got to the main game because I can't make the basic buildings anymore. So I was immediately like, well, why did you teach me that specific production chain, because you can't do it in the main game? Unless you get lucky, of course, you probably won't be able to do it. It's something I now need to work towards with my RNG, I suppose, and look out for things in the production chain I might need. But because I don't really know what all of the buildings in each production chain are going to be, that's very difficult. So I came away from the tutorial thinking the tutorial should have been, here's a huge chart with all of the production lines on it, so you can know, like, I've got the kiln here. Was putting the kiln down a good idea? Maybe, maybe not. You need to know all of the ingredients that can go into each thing and what each thing can be used for. An example would be the brewery that I took earlier. If I recall correctly, to use the main thing it makes, which is ale, you'll also need to take a farm to make the grain. You need to make pots before you can make ale as well, so you need to take clay and have a building that can produce pottery from clay, or I think you can use barrels instead of pots. I think barrels are made from wood and copper, so you might need a copper mine somewhere and a building that can smelt copper into copper ingots, and then you can combine them together in the brewery to make the ale, but you also need a building to serve the ale, such as a monastery, I can't remember now. Essentially, there are 5 or 6 buildings if you want to get ale into the population, which increases their happiness. And what you need to know is that this thing I'm vaguely remembering from my post-game experience now, not having that information up front, meant that all of the decisions around that were kind of meaningless, but it does ask you to make those decisions immediately. So it was very random even in my decision making at this stage because I don't know what I'm doing. Here I'm picking an objective. The objectives are randomly generated as well, or picked from a pool, I think, actually, rather than purely random. Do I want to take the delivered 12 packs of buildings material goal? Because I have no idea how hard that is, obviously I'm just going to make these decisions somewhat randomly. Later, these become interesting and meaningful things, but I think for the beginning of the game, it's a bit of a struggle. Just throwing somebody into the roguelike cycle, along with everybody else who's been in there for a long time, does make it hard to onboard with this game. And that's something worth mentioning because I actually had a pretty negative experience, probably because of that when I started the game, and I felt like I was almost tricked into disliking the game, and later I liked it a bit more. But perhaps later on, at the end of this commentary, we'll talk about why maybe I didn't like it as much in the end, if I remember to talk about that. It's a game that I think would benefit from you having foreknowledge of it, so unlike me, my new player experience was uniquely bad. Well, not uniquely bad, but specifically bad because I didn't really know what I was getting into. I was surprised how random everything was. I was surprised that it was a roguelike, and I'm not saying they're positive surprises either. But I learned to like it later on. Maybe some more effort needs to be made to pushing the player into the sorts of decisions that the game is actually going to be asking you to make, and less about just teaching them a couple of basic production chains that you can't really use early on, or you probably won't be able to use. Another thing I wanted to say before we really get into this commentary is that, well, a comment on the design overall. This whole idea of having the building pool be limited to things you're randomly drawing from a deck, I felt like that's a little bit of an overcomplication, and it doesn't achieve very much for the reason that the same thing is already achieved by the randomly generated maps. So I want to argue that you might be able to actually strip the drawing cards from the building pool thing out of the game without actually changing anything strategically, because what buildings you can use is defined by what resources spawn on the map and whether you find them, things like that. So at any given time, you only have access to enough resources to use a very small amount of the possible production trees. And that in itself is a limitation. At that stage, it doesn't matter whether the game lets you try to put those buildings down, because either way, nothing would happen. And I felt like it might be a bit easier to get into the game if the entire building pool was available to you, and you just unlocked more interesting things later, so the basic pool was available to you from the very beginning, if only so that you could look at it as the player and understand how it works. And I think it would be absolutely fine to have the player see that they do have a resource and just go to use it without hoping that they need the RNG to get the buildings out to use it. And I think to some extent, while the intent is that you see what resources you have and then you hope you do get the build you need from pools from the deck, and you have to adapt to what you actually end up getting to try and make your plan work with whatever you have in the end, which might not be the thing you were thinking of. They have to acknowledge, the developers, or they have acknowledged that this doesn't necessarily work, I think, because the game goes out of its way to water down that RNG process quite a lot, so they don't necessarily commit to the idea of you picking 3 buildings from a hand. Very early on it becomes 4, but more importantly, most buildings produce multiple things, and multiple things are produced by multiple buildings. That is to say, the buildings have overlap. So it's not actually the buildings you want, it's the ability to do something, and by simply attaching the ability to do something to loads of different buildings all across the production tree in random spots, this is the developer's way of allowing you to overcome the RNG effectively, because you probably will get the build that you want, and they effectively have to make it work like that. Otherwise they wouldn't have a game here. Like, if there was actually a reasonable chance of you not being able to utilize the resources on the map, that would be just too frustrating. If it's just random, like it gives you clay, for example, but then you can never make the building that turns clay into pottery, so you can't use your brewery that you accidentally took in the beginning, for example. Well, something like that would be frustrating, and you could see people not liking it. So it's watered down to the extent that, well, I don't have any memories of being like, I tried to do a strategy and it didn't work because of the RNG. So the RNG is there, almost just to make it feel like you have a chance of it not working. But in my vague anecdotal experience, it always does work, and it makes me end up thinking, maybe it just shouldn't be RNG from the beginning. Why don't you just let me put it down if the resources are there, and make the generation of the resources be the RNG source in the game, which it already is, and I'll argue that provides enough RNG already, and the extra RNG you've added on, you've then backpedaled by making all of the buildings multi-role. I don't know, there's something in the design there that's a little bit murky and messy that might be able to be fine-tuned down to a point when it would be easier to play and you'd still have essentially exactly the same game, and it might be easier to get into as well. There's essentially some kind of conflict or overlap in the design where the strategic question you're putting to the player could either be you have all the resources but only a random set of buildings, work out what you can do, or you have only a limited number of resources, use the buildings as you can. We've got both of those things happening overlapping, but both of them have to be watered down, so you usually get a lot of resources, you usually get the ability to produce almost everything. And I don't know, it feels like maybe the puzzle aspect is actually being made worse by the fact that 2 different strands are poking at the same random generating puzzle thing, and they'll have to diminish each other to keep the game flowing. So like, if you want to have a small pool of buildings, you'll have to provide loads of different resources, otherwise the chance that the player won't be able to take any actions is too high. And the other way around as well, if you want to provide loads of buildings, you have to provide limited resources in order to make there be any challenge at all. And those 2 strands are diminishing each other in some way. I think just because the game provides you with the solutions to both problems, and you don't need both. So you get quite a lot of resources, and most resources can be interchanged with other resources in the recipes for things in buildings, such that you don't have limited resources most of the time. And then on the other side of the coin, it also provides you with buildings that can make so many different things in different ways that you don't have limited uses for resources a lot of the time. Therefore, both aspects of the puzzle are made easier by the fact that it's trying to make it possible to play it in either a low resource or low building count way, but actually in practice neither will be the case because everything is so interchangeable. So the RNG based puzzle generation doesn't happen quite so much because so much work has to be done to undo that RNG in case the player can't solve the puzzle effectively anyway. That's my impression. I feel like a simplification could actually make the game more quote-unquote complex, in that more complex strategies would become available. But that's a argument that's very difficult to make by just gesturing my hands at a screen, so let's leave it there for now. Why don't we talk about the old classic thing that OffyD often forgets to talk about, what the game actually is. We're going to stop speculating and look at the game itself. Let's find some examples of what I'm talking about, and just go through what actually happens in the game to reveal its content and comment on what happens and comment on the strategies I'm going to be using as we go through. Hopefully I'll be able to reinforce my idea as well that this is more of a strategy game than a city builder. Perhaps first and foremost, because every time you make a city, it just gets deleted. So if you're actually here for the city building, I suppose you're going to be disappointed because really you're just making the start of a very small town over and over again. There needs to be something else to it, and it's more like the challenges that are different every time that provides that option. But then there's also the roguelike nature to consider. I'll probably end up arguing that the roguelike nature is either unnecessary or is detrimental in some way, similar to this idea of having conflicting sources of RNG that remove the RNG for all intents and purposes. Something. I've clearly got some big ideas about Against the Storm, but even I don't know what they are, so let's actually move on. I'm just going to skip to the end of the first stage now. Here's a town at its end, effectively. There's still more we can do with it, but it doesn't matter anymore after this. We're being very pro-lizard. We're doing some lizard supremacy strats to make the lizards like their life, which makes your score go up, allowing me to complete this stage. And we'll talk more about the details of that in a bit, I suppose. Here's something important though. Once you complete a stage, you have this list of completed deeds. And this, as it turns out, is a big focus of the game. It's similar to Into the Breach, which I did a first impressions video on this channel recently, where the actual objective of the game is to complete achievements rather than anything sort of in-game going on. So we're doing these various things, deeds as they're called, and we're going to trade these in for upgrades later. So it is a little bit more progression-y than Into the Breach, where the achievements all gave you side grades. Here, the actual progression of the game is tied to getting achievements. So you have to do certain things in the stages, essentially. A lot of them are just win the stage at first, of course, but once we've done those achievements, we can't get the bonus experience points for doing it again, so we need to do more interesting things. And here's us cashing that stuff in. We unlock various buildings and various cornerstones, as the game calls them, which are perks in general roguelike language. They're just bonuses that only last for one stage, which you can get randomly. So more things are being added to the pool of both buildings and perks that we'll have. There is an argument to be made that it's kind of bad to be adding things to your pool, because as you start off, you might be trying to get to grips with the pool. The pool getting bigger means you're less likely to get the thing that you want when you pull from the pool in your RNG drops. So to some extent, being told I'm given new buildings wasn't the best thing to have, like really early on in the game. I wasn't ready for new buildings, in my opinion. Well, there are now more buildings in the pool. I wouldn't know what to do with them if they were given to me, and I sort of hope they aren't given to me because I'd rather get used to using the original set of buildings, that sort of thing. We'll cash it all in, get level ups, and the level ups allow you to buy things from this other menu here, which are your permanent upgrades in the roguelike sense. So this is where the roguelike comes in. We could buy this thing giving me plus 2% burning duration at a hearth. That's something you have to do in stages. We'll talk about that later. We can make the game marginally easier by spending some of the currency we get for completing stages, meaning that when you have to start the game again, it will be a bit easier and maybe you'll get a bit quote-unquote further, although I'll argue there isn't really anywhere to go, but we'll look at that later. We can get various upgrades to various things. So that's the loop. Do stages to get some currency, try and get achievements to level up, which unlocks things you can buy in the shop to make doing the stages easier, potentially allowing you to get more achievements, and get further in the game. Further literally means moving further away from the middle of the map in this case. the loop of the game is that you're making towns. Every time you make a town, you can make a new town a couple of tiles further out from the middle of the world map. And your goal is to get towards these shiny, colourful things, the seals. You can use the seals to extend the global time limit the next time you play the game. So at the bottom there's a bar, that purple bar. That's a global time limit, so if that reaches the far right, you start the entire game again. So that's the big roguelike loop that's going on. You've got enough time to make 3 or 4 towns, and then the game will start again and your towns will be deleted, the world map is reset, and you start again. But if you had managed to reach the seal during your game, the next game will have more years added to it. I think it's 4 years or 8 years or something is added, and the years are time that passes in-game, so it's incentivizing you there to play as quickly as possible so that you can put down as many towns as possible before the game resets, get as far away from the middle as possible, get as many rewards as possible, and as many level up things as possible to make it easier next time. Well, let's go through this. We're going to start making our second town. First, we decide what settlers and resources we'll take with us to begin with. I think there's a random aspect to this, but this thing on the right is a non-random aspect where you can choose certain resources to start your town with. In this case, we don't have a choice really, because we're still at the start of the game. Maybe we'll see more of that later. At the beginning, we now have 4 choices for our building pools, so that's nice. It's getting a little bit more varied and less RNG-ish. We get the farm right away. That's the thing I was lacking in the previous stage, so that's something I know what to do with. And for my second pick, I took the rain mill, because that allows you to turn wheat from the farm I just took into flour. Now I'm looking for something to do with the flour, and the scribe here can make ale. And you can use the wheat to make ale as well if you also have some other stuff. So maybe that's something I want to think about. I'm looking for something more like a bakery, but it's just not here at the moment. It might still show up later though. And we're seeing some of the crossover of buildings. So the scribe makes scrolls and ale, but we saw before the brewery is the main thing that makes ale, but also the lumber mill makes scrolls, which is the main product of the scribe. So they can all make each other's things a little bit, but they make them worse if they don't specialize in it. So essentially, that's where the RNG watering down comes in. If I really wanted a build that makes ale right away, which probably wouldn't be very useful, I could potentially have done it even though the game doesn't let you build whatever you want. It gave me enough options that I could get what I want probably anyway, that sort of thing. Let's go through what's happening. We start off the stage by just throwing down woodcutter camps because we need to cut down some trees near the initial area to reveal more of the map. And in later stages you'll see I tended to do this before taking any pulls on buildings, because you might want to expand the map a bit more to see what randomly generated resources you're given before you start thinking about what buildings you're going to make later. Because you can see I've picked all those buildings, but I can't make them right away, so I might as well not make that decision now, since something might change and change my mind on my building decisions. Here are the so-called cornerstones, the perks I was talking about. I think you need to know what resources your biome is likely to have in it before you start making these decisions, which I probably don't right now. So for example, one of them is about meat specifically, so if my town won't generate any meat in the future just because that's not on the map, then that wouldn't have been useful. There is actually a 20% chance to get some meat while picking eggs, so even some resource nodes have a bit of other resource nodes on them in a further watering down and blurring of the lines there on the strategic challenge. Well anyway, we need to do something more explicit in our strategy, and that is pick our orders. The orders automatically give you reputation points if you complete them, and as we'll see, we need those to do pretty much anything. So these are important ways to advance your town, and you get some choice over what objectives you're going to take, which I really like. That's always a fun thing to do. And we happen to be able to take some relatively easy objectives here that are already in line with what I was thinking of doing. We need to get a farm set up basically, because I've taken a farm and a farming based objective, and we're focusing on humans as well. There are different species who can live in your town who specialize in different things. Humans are good for farms, so if you're going for a farm build, having a load of humans will be useful. But whether or not you can go for a farm build depends on whether you get any farmland generating on the map. There usually will be some. We need it to be near where we are now. And we also took a pretty easy goal based around building houses. Later, I tended to not build houses in the beginning. Houses increase the happiness of your people, but you don't necessarily need them very much for a while. If you're not going to get enough happiness that you reach the little blue mark in the top left on our happiness meter, then it doesn't really matter what your happiness is. Basically, they're either happy enough that you're gaining points, or they're just not. So the difference between having 1 happiness and 29 happiness is nothing. Once you get 30 happiness, for example, you start gaining some reputation, which is the blue bar towards the bottom left center of the screen. Filling that up not only completes the stage if you fill it up all the way, but along the way it unlocks more buildings, so you have to get reputation somehow to have any hope of doing anything. Now, we do get farmland. In the first glade we check, so we can start our farm build already. We're in business now. Although, of course, we still need to pull from the deck cards that will use the products of the farm. So maybe something that will use flour to make pie, I think, and biscuits can be made. And maybe a brewery to get something going with the ale as well. And preferably more farms, because you need more than one little patch here to sustain a town and a population of the size you'll have by the end of the stage. The stage usually being about an hour in duration, so that's the sort of game time we're talking here. Now, I'm going to stop progressing forward with the editing just to rant about some more things right here. I thought I'll just explain various things in the game and give a few thoughts on them, because there's no good time to do it. I might as well just do it as soon as possible. And this is the topic of the various cycles. This was something that interested me while playing. There are lots of mechanics in the game that are soft caps and limits and cycles of various kinds, where something is changing over time. There are loads of different time-limited based mechanics going on in the background. So let's see if I can even remember all of them. First off, in the bottom center right, there's that red bar, which is standing equal and opposite to our blue bar. The red bar is impatience. That's just a straight up time limit. So it goes up over time. If you mouse over it, it'll tell you how fast it's going up. You get a certain number of impatience points per minute of time that passes while you're playing the game. So that's just a time limit. I guess you fail if it reaches the top. In my experience, it never reached the top or even got close, because I think every time you earn a reputation point, your impatience goes down a bit by a set amount. So if you're just making progress, your time limit is being extended over time. And I managed to never really get towards the end of the time limit. There are a few mechanics in the game, such as perks, that will be based on what your impatience score is. So there are ways to actually do crazy builds where you try and get to the end of the time limit to build up some sort of bonus that's based on the time limit almost being over. I noticed that that was possible now and again, but I never really had the bravery to even think about going for such a thing. So that's one time limit. Another time limit is something that I mentioned briefly a second ago, the hearth burning thing. So the blue building that you start with, that thing that looks a bit like a tortoise, is your hearth. And it burns fuel over time, and I believe you get a huge penalty to happiness and potentially get issues with another aspect of the cycles I'll talk about in a sec, if you don't have fuel burning in the hearth all the time. At the very top you can see I've got my fuel resource thing selected where it says 96 and a picture of a fire. I've got 82 wood and 14 coal, so I've got some stuff I can burn. And because a lot of the game is based around cutting down trees, you often have a lot of wood, so that's going to be a handy fuel supply. But you can try to get things like coal, either by turning the wood into charcoal or by mining coal if there happens to be some on the map. And you can also make oil, I believe, and burn that. There's even like a sort of fossil fuel mechanic where you can dig up fossils and put them in just like as direct fossil fuel. So there are various ways to keep the hearth going, and that's a time limit of sorts, because of course there's a finite amount of fuel you can put in there, so eventually things will get very difficult and potentially untenable because there's no fuel to run the hearth, and that's your second effective time limit mechanic, this time with no explicit time attached to it. It's just that you will be in trouble eventually. Your town is fundamentally unsustainable, so you have to get out of the game and just let your town be deleted before anything goes too wrong, effectively. Now the next thing is hostility. If you cast your eyes to the top of the screen, you'll see there's another blue and red meter combo going on. We'll talk about what the blue thing is in a sec. The red meter at the top, where there's like an eye looking at you, is forest hostility. This is also a time limit, as it turns out. That red bar goes up, but it can go up multiple times, and the number next to the eye where it says 0 is how many times you've filled it up. It goes up as time passes, but it also goes up as you cut down trees and open up more territory. So there's this explicit punishment, I suppose, for taking up space on the map as the forest comes to hate you. And as the bar fills up, your people's happiness goes down. So it gets harder and harder, both the more space you take up and the longer you take, because it goes up both with building and with waiting, just like the impatience bar. So that's another thing, the hostility, quote-unquote, time limits happening down there, or up there if you want to use the correct direction. Let's use the correct direction. It's up there. So what's the other thing that's up there? The blue bar is also moving around in a circle. That looks kind of like a timer as well. Well, it is something of a timer. This is the timer that's feeding into the hostility bar. So the 1 to the top left of that UI element is how many years you've been in the game for. And that also ties into the global time limit, of course. So as the blue bar goes round, it progresses the seasons in the year. I think there are 3 seasons with different status effects happening in each one. We can talk about that a bit in a while. And every 3 seasons, I think, the year counter goes up. This causes your hostility to go up. And that year counter is the thing you're playing against on the world map. So you want the stage to last as few of those in-game years as possible so that you can make more towns before the world ends. The world ends every 40 years or something on the world map. For a reason, some lore reason. So that's the roguelike part just coming in. We need to play fast and furious because we've got all those different time mechanics happening at the same time. And then there's the more like general time mechanic of, well, it's similar to the fuel thing really, as well as the fuel running out, thus providing you a sort of time limit. There's going to be a finite amount of food, a finite amount of all the things that produce happiness. And you can get to a stage when, if you complete every mission but you still haven't got enough reputation points to leave the stage, the only way to leave is to get enough happiness to build up reputation. But there is a finite amount of the stuff that you use to make happiness. So if you don't have everything going all at once and you don't get enough happiness, you could be in trouble there. So there's sort of a soft cap time limit in that you can run out of just stuff aside from fuel. The other stuff might be needed to complete the stage. And then there's food, which I guess is a different category where you'll definitely not complete the stage if you run out of food. And there can be a finite supply of food. With the farm, it's producing infinite food, but in a certain amount. So a small population can be sustained infinitely there. But because of the other things, you can't actually sustain the population infinitely, so that doesn't really help. Well, there are many things going on, and this sort of creates this mood, this panicked mood you might call it, where you have to be playing optimally from the beginning. And I was very aware of this, and it's an interesting vibe, I think, to have all of these things going on at once. Because I suppose from a game design perspective, I was thinking, is there a way to have there be fewer caps? Like, do we have to have 2 red bars filling up over time that both do bad things? Like, maybe there's some way to just forget some of the mechanics because the mechanics that already exist do the same thing. A similar argument to what I was making earlier, I suppose. They've added a lot of mechanics with overlap here, which is sort of a theme of the game, like everything in the game overlaps with everything because it has to, because other things overlap already, something. Some detailed argument exists here for making a slightly scaled down version of Against the Storm that would be just as good, but have like one fewer thing to worry about, or one fewer thing to learn, one fewer thing to program and test around, and just everything might be a bit easier for everybody involved. If say hostility was just like refactored into the impatience mechanic in some way, something like that. Well, the other thing I wanted to mention was the yearly cycle is based around this idea that it's always raining. So this is going to be a very tonal comment I wanted to make. This is a game where it's kind of got this chill but dour atmosphere going on. City builders tend to be really good for being a chill, calming game, a relaxing sort of game. But as I mentioned, this is a game where everything is 1,000 time limits deep, so it's not really chill and relaxing. You're always trying to be in a sort of panicked rush to play things as optimally as possible. And I suppose the more you know about quote-unquote strategy games, the more you realize how unoptimal everything you're doing is all the time. For example, in a game like this, there are always advantages to, like, say, not building houses, as I mentioned earlier, or not staffing buildings, or like constantly micromanaging where your people are on a moment-to-moment basis to try and get the most out of a small labor pool, things like that. And there are real in-game advantages, and big ones too, for playing really optimally like that. So I felt very under pressure the whole time, because there's always a ticking clock as well in the background. And it's a lot to think about, to the extent that right now, for example, in the footage, I've actually completed a mission, and it took me a while to even notice I did it, and you want to notice you've completed a mission as soon as possible to get the reward for it, because you have to manually accept the reward. Here, the reward includes more people, so we want those as soon as possible to put them to work and just positive feedback loop our way into an easier game. Before I distracted myself there, I was just going to say, to conclude my rant, I think, and perhaps actually get into some more commentary, that the rain-based lore is conflicting, I guess, with the two other vibes that the game has. Like, there are three vibes at the same time. There's the calm city builder vibe that is sort of emanating from the concept and from the graphical style and from the fantasy setting of the game. It feels like it's going to be a chill city builder. Then there's the panicked, high micro, uber strategy gamer aspect, where you want to micromanage and min-max absolutely everything, and not only does that give you an advantage in the game, but the game's kind of only about that mechanically. Like, if you were doing anything but that, you'd be playing it wrong, and the game would just be hard and less enjoyable. So there's two vibes there, and the third vibe is from the rain itself. You live in a miserable world where everybody's unhappy, and one of the core cycles is that every third season it rains more than any other seasons, and your people get unhappy about it. So you've got this game that's kind of about managing how miserable people are that it's raining all the time. And look, I'm literally from the United Kingdom, okay? I don't need this in a video game right now. Can't it be more like they're neutral while it's raining a lot and they get happy when it stops raining sometimes? I think that would be a little bit nicer, something like that. I don't know, this is a very vague point to make. And because you're in this apocalyptic world where everybody dies every 40 years or something, I think everyone might actually survive because they go back into the town in the middle of the map, which is the one town that doesn't die for whatever reason. So, I don't know, there's a sort of inevitability of failure to everything, not only because of the time limits on the shorter time scale, but because no matter what you do, your town is deleted later, which really pulls you out of the immersion. And this compounds with the fact that it's always goddamn raining, that there's just a really moody, miserable atmosphere, which then conflicts with those two other atmospheres of it being potentially chill and potentially a sort of high-stress micro-experience, creating this really weird overall vibe. And I guess the fact that it has really like calming and chill music in the background the whole time as well is in some way feeding into that. I get this weird vibe from this game. I wouldn't go as far as to say that I like it, but it appeals to me in some way. I kind of like that it's chill, and I suppose I dislike the less chill elements. That's probably the way I'm leaning. Makes me wish that maybe there was one or two fewer things that were finite and time limited, and of course it makes me wish it wasn't a roguelike as well, but I probably would have wished that no matter the situation, because I just don't really appreciate roguelikes very much. I always think that something has to be sacrificed to make a game a roguelike. Or, to put it another way, you have to not put in things you might expect there to be in a game to make it a roguelike. You have to make it worse than an ordinary game using the same gameplay concept. I think. Maybe I'll try and back up that random statement later. You probably noticed I did the thing again where I said I'm going to commentate on the actual gameplay and instead just went off on tangents. I think I might be done describing the game and my various thoughts on it, so we might be able to look at some specifics now, for real this time. Looks like I just made the potential mistake of taking the smokehouse. The reason is the smokehouse there would allow me to make jerky, but I think jerky can only be made from insects and meat and probably something else as well, I forget. And I don't have, right now, any source of those things. So I just made a bad decision again, and that's probably because I didn't understand what jerky was made of or something, or what it could be made of, or whether I would eventually get meat. I'm not sure when I learned like what's on each map. At the beginning of a map it tells you what resources can spawn on the map, but I'm pretty sure I wasn't paying attention to that, at least in the first few stages, so I was just hoping I'd get the resources I needed somehow, even in cases where I could have known that actually I would never get them. So essentially that was a bad choice. But we can always hope. There are many more glades to look at. Who knows what resources will be in them? Well, once you get enough game experience, you can sort of guess or expect what's going to be there, because it's certain things based on the biome, usually. It's time for us to make some packs, which we're going to do the slow and bad way, using this makeshift post. By all that I mean, we're going to package some of our resources up into so-called packs, and you can see on the right, if I have enough of those packs of crops and provisions, I'll be completing some missions. The makeshift post thing is like a bad way of doing it that I didn't really realise. Essentially, you can package up your resources from the beginning of the game using this makeshift post, which you can always build, but it just does it badly, so it uses way more resources to make one pack's worth. And it's better to have a building that explicitly makes the packs for you. But I wasn't really paying attention to the efficiency at this stage because I still didn't know what I was doing at the more basic level. Here I am, taking a quick look at the way I could change out the resources needed to buy some more people from that glade. That's something I think the game needs to do a little bit of a better job explaining, because I just sort of stumbled across in my second stage, I believe, the ability to change out what resource something uses, because I didn't realise it was a clickable button for a long time. Essentially, every time it says a thing needs this resource, if you click on the resource, you can change it to just needing something else, and that's again part of the watering down system to let you get away with everything. But for a while, I didn't really realise how to use it, essentially. Doesn't matter too much. Now, I just took the Trapper's Camp, something I barely need, because I'm doubling down on my jerky strategy, and that's because I've got some lizards now. The lizards will get some extra happiness if I can give them that jerky. I don't have a meat supply, so I can't really do this. There's a chance of getting meat from eggs, so that's what I'm banking on right now. The reason I'm going so hard on this is not only because I have to double down on the strategy I already started doing because I made a mistake earlier, but that it's something that makes the lizards happy, and making the lizards happy is kind of easy, so it's an easy way to get happiness points by focusing on pro-lizard stuff. So here we are a bit later, making the lizards happy in a different way. We still don't have that meat or jerky, but I can just be racist. This is something you can do at any time to gather some happiness on one of your population classes. You click on the favor button, and their happiness goes up, but in exchange everybody else's happiness goes down. But as mentioned before, what everybody else's happiness is doesn't matter unless it's negative. So it's fine to just make somebody's happiness go down in exchange to make somebody's happiness go up that you get points for them being happy. This is something that I struggled with early on because you have to remember to do it effectively and notice when you can do it, and I wasn't very good at staying on top of that. Looks like it's time for another pull, and I'm going to take the human house, something I can use to increase human happiness. The class-specific or race-specific house is one of the few buildings you can actually unlock and take out of the randomized pool so that you can just use it whenever you want. So in a late game against the Storm mission, you'd be able to make specific houses for each race and get extra happiness right from the very beginning because of that. And obviously that will make everything else easier because there's less stuff in the pool getting in the way once you unlock that. For now though, we have to waste quote-unquote one of our pools by taking the human house. Maybe we'll use it to get enough human happiness later, but as I said, I'm going for lizard happiness in my strategy, and it matters to have a strategy because you need something to make decisions like this when it gives you a new order, or even if it was just another building pool or a perk choice. You want things that synchronize with your strategy. So here I have the opportunity to take as a mission, give the lizards jerky, which I was planning to do already, and I've already started getting the building chain to do it. So that's an example of a useful sync up. Here, we're going to do something not in sync for a different reason. I suppose both options are in sync here. I can really easily complete that first mission, which would also give me more townspeople, but I'm going for the second mission because the reward is all of the stuff I need to complete the previous mission. So now, even if I don't actually ever get my jerky production going, I can get a mission reward, which is enough jerky to complete the jerky production mission. And while we have that jerky, we'll get the happiness as well. And the lizards are already almost happy enough to be generating us points because they have low standards effectively. This is another case where if I was being racist right now, I'd be gaining points, and I just straight up don't notice all the time. What often happens is I notice right before the stormy season, and because in the stormy season you lose all of your happiness, you can't do the racism strats to get points effectively. So I was just leaving points on the table all the time throughout most of my early town builds, and it always annoyed me every time I noticed, because every time I went to click on the button, I'd be like, oh, I can get extra points by doing this. Oh wait, I could have been doing that for ages, so I could have had extra buildings already, could have had extra points already. Like, everything is compounding, and you notice how much you failed over and over again, and that was annoying me every time. Basically, I was like, I need some sort of notification that just pops up saying, if you were racist now, you would be gaining points, because it was just too much for me to keep track of. Eventually, I got a bit better at that, because I became more obsessed with being racist, like any good video gamer. What I actually need for some true lizard supremacy though is a long-term source of that jerky, so that we can keep their happiness high for a long time. And this does matter because over time, as you milk the happiness out of the lizards, their threshold for how happy they have to be goes up. So you need to keep making things better to keep getting points from happiness, or you switch to favouring another race essentially, or focusing on another race's needs who currently still have lower standards. But by the little blue marks in the top left, you can see the standards of the dwarves and the humans, or the beavers I should say, that's what the dwarves are too high for us to even consider doing anything with our current build, so we just can't use that strat. But you might have spotted there, we captured a glade that has a couple of snails in it which we can use for meat. We now have a temporary meat supply, so the plan is on. Soon there will be jerky, and right now we don't even need the jerky to be milking the lizard happiness. So later, we're going to be using our jerky technique to get even more lizard happiness milk out of them, and other great gameplay comments. A bit later, I've built the trade center, the trading post, where you can sometimes trade things for cash or other things. It's quite rare actually to be able to use the trading system. And I suppose that's by design, because in theory, you can deal with all of the problems your settlement has in terms of lacking things and lacking buildings by going to the trader and just trading what you do have for something you don't have. Just like in real life, guys, but this life is miserable, so we're generally not allowed to trade. There'll be like a short time window now and again, every 10 minutes or something, when you're allowed to make a trade, so you have to hope you have something in reserve ready to trade for when the guy shows up, and that they'll have something you want, because what the traders actually carry, I think it's based on which trader shows up, they'll have a certain selection from a certain pool of goods. So you might get something you need, but if they don't have something you need, you could trade it for cash and hope the next guy does instead. We don't really have the industry to be mass trading away things right now, but in theory, you could go really heavily just into something and then trade it all away at the first opportunity to get something you actually wanted, if the thing you wanted wasn't going to be easy to make on a map. Here I am starting my second hearth. So we can increase our fuel consumption effectively to have 2 hearths instead of 1. This means there's more of the map that counts as housing area. You can see the orange highlighted area here are places where you can put houses. We're limited right now because I haven't cleared the forest on the other side of our starting hearth, so we don't have much space to make our town. Also, the area of the town around the warehouse, the big red building, is prime real estate because everything's efficiency is tied to how close it is to a warehouse. So by starting a second town area, we can get more space, but of course we'll be using more fuel, and having the people walk off somewhere else to take their breaks by the fire might also reduce efficiency if you're really paying attention to things like that. It also reduces the hostility bar, one of those many time limits to have 2 hearths at the same time. I think because burning fuel in the fire is what the forest likes or something, even though we're getting the fuel by cutting the forest down. Not quite sure. There's some magic or religious aspect to it that helps us out to have 2 fires burning in the forest that hates being cut down. As you can see, we've cut down enough of the forest to unlock a so-called forbidden glade. Some of the glades are much bigger than the other ones, so you want to cut into them to get more space as soon as possible. However, you're limited in your ability to do this early on, because they come with some sort of penalty or a downside, where you have to complete a challenge, or the game will screw you over in some way. I think it's a bit random what it's going to be, but usually there's some sort of thing where, like 10 minutes after you open the glade, there'll be a big penalty, such as it will kill off some of your villagers or blow up buildings or something, unless you complete a challenge, and the challenge is always just spend some resources. But you don't know whether it will be resources you actually have or can make, so it's a bit of a risk to open a glade when you might actually not be able to solve the problem, and it will just cause the problem that's coming up on the timer. In this case, while I don't produce the things I need to get the result I want, I happen to have 30 incense stored away, probably as a quest reward from earlier on, so I can use that to get the outcome to this challenge, which gives me some ancient tablets, which if you were looking really closely is the thing I need to complete the mission, which gives me loads of jerky as well. Not that we even need to do that anymore because we have our own jerky production, but I'll get a point for completing the mission anyway. Basically, my strategy was too clever. I didn't even need to do my awfully clever strategy, but that's only because I got lucky in actually finding a source of meat. If I hadn't done that, I would now be cashing in on my insurance policy and would be getting away with things anyway. Here I missed my opportunity to take the carpenter from that pull, which in retrospect I regret. The carpenter and the baker are my favourite buildings. The baker, which we have right here in fact, because it produces so much stuff that contributes to making happiness go up all over the place. It's great for trying to grind happiness, and the carpenter's great for the stuff I'm not really talking about in the background, where you have to convert fibres and wood into fabric and planks to make most buildings, and clay and stone into bricks as well. So there's a bit of building economy in the background you need to be able to put buildings down, and the carpenter's really useful for that, and it has an extremely useful secondary feature that I didn't really use in this game at all actually. That we'll talk about in the future. Anyway, a bit later, I actually did get that human happiness up as well. We were grinding happiness and we just blast through the objective because we complete a bunch of missions, with some even yet to complete. This is because we're playing on easy difficulty. Yeah, that's the secret, it turns out. And playing on easy difficulty is a genuine strategy in this game, because you only have to get 12 points to win instead of 14 points, which obviously means the games are faster, and how fast the games go matters. So we got out of the town earlier than normal, allowing us potentially to squeeze in another town if we do all of the towns on easy, something like that. Although as you get further away from the middle, I think it forces you to play on higher difficulties. So it looks like we've used a bit less than half the time, and we're a bit less than halfway to the green shiny thing that we need to progress the campaign overall. So things are going well. Looks like I forgot to name my town as well, and it got given a random word. Interesting. Well, it's time for us to spend the resources we got, and we didn't get very many resources. That's the big downside to playing on easy. You get a far smaller reward, so your progression through the game's upgrade tree will be way slower. I think it's 3 times the reward to play on normal instead of easy. But on easy, villagers eat less food, as it says at the bottom there, but more importantly to me, the games are just shorter, which is nicer in terms of playing against the time limit, and itself makes everything easier because it doesn't matter so much that you can run out of resources and such, because you just probably won't. You're less likely to run out of something before you've done all the missions you need to. For the upgrade, you might have spotted I took an upgrade that gives me extra people at the start of a new town. This was a great upgrade that I went straight for, because it's one of these positive feedback loop things where if you start the town with a couple of extra people, your early game will be like 50% faster, because that small number of people is a big proportional increase to what you normally start with. So you can blast through the early exploration, see things faster, and get an idea of what your strategy is going to have to be. Looks like I'm cancelling my plans there to go straight for a forbidden glade. We get bad RNG, I suppose, in this map generation, because the forbidden areas are all around the middle, so it's hard for us to expand without potentially forcing ourselves into a resource challenge about a resource we don't have and probably won't be able to get so early on, so we just have to be careful there. You might note the map is now blue, but aside from that, everything's pretty much the same, and this is probably where the game begins to fall down. I'm just starting again, we're making another town, making our decisions once again, but everything is looping, and of course, not only is it looping in terms of each town having to be rebuilt every time or being a restart every time, but of course once you've built 3 or 4 towns you restart the game and now you don't even have the words on the map that represented you building those previous towns. It's as if you started again, but with plus 2% something like that. That's the roguelike promise. But it does grind you down over time. So if you're already bored thinking, oh, he's just going to make another town, what's he going to talk about here? I suppose that's a valid concern. All I'm going to be doing in this video is talking about the, I think it was 10 or so towns that I made while playing Against the Storm. They're all kind of the same, I guess, because they all use most of the building pool. But sometimes the trees are blue. So this is the effect of being in a different biome. There are also different perks and random effects happening in the background because of the trees. I don't remember what they were, so I guess that means they weren't that significant or didn't play into things that much. We're broadly just going to play the same. We put down woodcutters buildings to cut down these blue things, and they give you wood, same as a tree, so it's the same idea. I should mention though, in the game's favour, it has loads of great tutorial information in this codex you can open up. It's trying to teach me about some issue there's going to be here. Once it gets stormy, if there's also loads of hostility, we're going to get even more sadness than usual. It's so miserable around this blue forest that when it rains, people are going to go absolutely berserk with misery. So that's a shame. Just means we want our base happiness to not be so low that it's going to go below 0 once it starts raining real hard and once we've expanded enough to get that hostility up. Something to keep in mind. I probably wasn't keeping it in mind while playing because there were too many other things to think about. Well, we're back at it again. We've got that meat right here, but we don't have any lizards to use it on, so maybe we can hope for a pie build to come through where we can use the meat to make pie for the humans, something like that. Well, of course, we just sit back and hope for the best. Cut to Chapter 2, Disappointment. We did not get the farms, it turns out, the farmland, I should say, after cutting into the space where I wasn't going to trigger any of the penalty challenge things. So what are we going to do? We're going to trigger some penalty challenge things, basically. I'm going to have to just go into one of these areas. And actually, the hardest area is the shiniest one. This one here is glowing gold, sometimes, very rarely in my experience. If you go into one of the glades at a certain time, you'll get a so-called treasure stag. I didn't know what that meant, but it's time to find out by the looks of things. We're going to move the woodcutters over to this area and cut a path inside. I believe this is not a forbidden glade, but a dangerous glade or something, like a slightly harder version of the usual resource challenge, but in reward, the areas are quite big and they're full of stuff, so there's loads of resources in here. I'm clicking around trying to find out what they are, sort of ignoring the giant mole in the room, so to speak. There is a gigantic mole taking up quite a lot of space here. We need to do something about this guy, so this is going to be the resource challenge. It's always a different thing in the lore, but what all the challenges are just, do you have some resources? It's always that, rather than being like, I don't know, build this within a time limit or something, like a specific challenge. It's just, do you have something? And if you do have it, which in this case we do, we're fine. That was actually a really easy resource challenge, having 20 eggs, because a lot of the time you start the game with 20 eggs. So for that being one of the harder challenges, I guess it was quite easy, it seems. Well anyway, here's the treasure stag. There is a stag standing here. And the treasure, it turns out it gives you, is a perk, which I wasn't that interested in, I suppose, because most of the perks, in my experience, are for doing something really specific. It's like a perk that makes it better if you're harvesting berries or something like that. And you might just be offered that and it is no use to you because you're not going to be harvesting berries, something like that. In this case, we take an option that removes one of your perks in order to get 2 more, because I think I had a perk I didn't want, but I lost the perk that I did want of the 2 I had already, so I got screwed over by my gamble there, as I seem to recall, but at least we worked out how that part of the game functions, so that was what I was really trying to do, I suppose. There's also a bunch of boxes in here. The boxes are a really great way to make the stage go faster, and I didn't really appreciate this early on. That's where the unique resource tools comes into play. You can exchange tools for reputation points for all intents and purposes at the box piles by just having the box piles disappear and you get points. And doing that a couple of times can dramatically speed up the game. But you need a source of tools to do so, so oftentimes you actually can't do it. But when you can, doing it makes the game way faster, and we'll see more of that as we go along. For the first time, I started running out of fuel on this stage. I think it might be because these mushroom trees that we're cutting down give you less wood than normal, or something like that. Or maybe it's because I started my second hearth relatively early, so I was burning more fuel than we really need to in this situation. Well anyway, I need to put more people onto wood cutting. Here's an example of a useless perk pick. I saw these 2 things and I just thought, well, we either can't use or don't want to use either. Luckily, you can often take money instead of perks, which is quite handy, and we can even spend the money right now, but this trader didn't have what I need. We don't have, on this map, any source of the raw materials to make fabric, which is the blue thing in my inventory on the right, which we barely have any of, and loads of buildings require you to have fabric, so we're kind of locked out of a lot of the production lines right now because we just don't have something that's right at the bottom. It's not spawning on the map. We don't have a trader giving it to us. So you're just sort of stuck. And that's interesting to have as a challenge. Like, can you get by without building any of the fabric requiring building lines? Because some of them don't require fabric, you can still make some progress without it. And that sort of decision making is at the core of what is fun about the game, trying to get by with what the game gives you. But again, it's always going to give you enough to get by, so it's not as if you're making any tough choices, I suppose. Well, to some extent it's based on your own build, and my inexperience is making this aspect of the game more frustrating than it probably is supposed to be to veteran players. Like right now, I tried to spec into biscuits with the cookhouse because all of my people want biscuits. This would be a great way to get happiness. But I can't get either flour or any of the secondary ingredients of biscuits on this map right now. I really need some farm fields to appear. And I've already taken the farm from my building pool, so I'm ready to do it. And as if to mock me, here's a mission to deliver 20 grain. So if I had a farm, that would be trivially easy. We'll take the other one instead. But the mission to give out clothing also requires that you have plant fibers, the thing that's the base ingredient of fabrics. So again, that's another thing we don't do. We're lacking 2 strands of the basics here on this map. So we have to make a decision about whether we're going to adapt and try to go for a different build, or whether we do what I'm actually going to do, which is just try to cut down into as many glades as possible and hope we get better rolls on what turns out to be in them. Hope we get something that we need, or at least enough of something we need to temporarily complete an objective and then just get out of here, that sort of thing. But what I wonder is, would it actually be viable for me to try and spec into something else now, like after I've taken my building pools? Probably not. And again, the developers are likely aware of that, so they have to give you an out if you've gone down a bad route, or a route that turned out to be bad in retrospect. There still needs to be something you can do. And actually, there was, because one of the Forbidden Glades had this resource challenge, where if you complete it using the right path, where you have essentially 2 paths for what reward you want, the reward would be to unlock a bunch of farm fields, or fertile land to make farm fields, I should say. We also got a trader who was carrying tons of tools, those things we can convert straight into points. So that's ideal. We'll use that to open the various boxes around the place and start building up reputation points, unlocking more buildings, and making it so that basically nothing else matters. Like, if you get loads of good box drops on the map, and you find a way to get loads of tools, such as somebody just comes and happens to be able to sell you loads, then you're in business essentially. The money you get from opening boxes easily pays you back the price of buying tools. But in this case, there is another box-based strategy, because the box next to the cauldron happened to contain the things we need to solve the cauldron's resource challenge. So by not opening the box with tools, and by smashing the box, which is like a different thing that gives you a different reward, we'll take what's in the box for ourselves, then go and solve the cauldron thing, unlocking some fertile land, and we're in business. The only thing that's holding me back still is the lack of those fabrics again. You can see I've got loads of building plans down on the ground, and I've got loads of unemployed citizens in the very top left. That is because I'm trying to set up the production lines to do all the things I want to do, but I'm just missing something at the very beginning, and I'm still hoping to get it. We don't have either plant fibers or reeds. And we actually now do have a way to get around that problem. We're late enough in the game that it doesn't matter much anymore. We could just complete the game another way. But we can make this the plantation. So I had to waste another building pool to get the plantation, which is an alternate version of the farm that makes plant fibers instead of crops. So that's going to screw over my main plan. The whole point of all the stuff I'm setting up is to make flour and then biscuits, hopefully anyway. But that's not going to happen. I also need to make pack of crops, but I think I can make those from mushrooms, which are all over the place. So that's an easier thing to go for right now. We're having to do some tactical racism here because it's raining so much. Another great excuse. The harpies were getting so unhappy that they might leave, essentially, and I'm trading off the happiness of the beavers and gambling them against each other, because your people will leave after a while of being unhappy, but the storms are short enough that they might actually not finish leaving before the storm stops, and they'll be like, oh, it's not raining, okay, I won't abandon this town, I suppose. I don't know, guys, it rains everywhere, there's no hope leaving. Well, anyway, we just blasted through the end of the mission somehow, because we got some really easy orders, like put down roads and stuff right at the end, and just got loads of points, and I never finished the build I was going for, which brings up the point I wanted to mention, which is that at this stage, for example, it would be nice to say, I want to keep going and go for a bigger reward. Because our town had loads of orders unfulfilled. I was sort of about to complete the things I'd been working towards throughout the entire build of the town, but we completed the mission sort of accidentally just along the way, and now we're just out, so that's gone. And you might be thinking that was a very abrupt end to the commentary on that town. Well, yes, it is, because that's just what it's like, you just leave. And you pick the difficulty of the town at the beginning, essentially. So I could have got in on a higher difficulty in that case, and kept going. And all that stuff I was setting up and working out would have paid off later. But it doesn't, because I was playing on low difficulty. But I sort of have to play on low difficulty because I'm trying to speedrun at the same time. So there were those conflicting incentives again. And what I'd love for it to do is just say, do you want to just stay in the town? Like, you've completed the easy objectives. Do you want to stay and go for the normal tier objectives and get a better reward? Or will you leave now and just move on to the next town? it giving you the choice to do that rather than it being forced upon you at the end based on your earlier choices where you didn't know how much fun you were going to have. I think that might be a little bit better. Potentially it's a balancing issue where they want you to gamble on the stage being good by committing to a hard version of the stage earlier on. I don't know, I feel like it might be more fun to just have all of the easy, normal, hard, extra hard objectives be there from the beginning, and it's just get as far as you want in each town and then move on. Gamble that you'll be able to reach the next tier based on what you've seen so far in the town and what buildings you've got, so that it would feel more satisfying to get a quote-unquote good run, where you feel like I've got the perks I need, I've got the buildings I need, I think I'm going to get the resources I need, I'm going to turn this normal run into a very hard run. Let's go all in and try to get the reward. I feel like that would be more fun than coming away from the normal run thinking, I could have gone for more there, but I didn't, and I never got to finish what I was doing. Like, I was interrupted, I'm kicked out of the town, now I have to make the beginning of the town again. Oh, that's a shame. Now, what's actually happening in this footage I'm showing you here? I'm getting screwed over by the language it's using. The game says, when you mouse over the seal, that if it's within your embarkation range at the end of a cycle, you can do the thing which increases the cycle length. So it looks like to me I've already completed what I need to do here because it is within my range. Your range is 2 tiles away from your towns. So if I just click the button in the bottom right that ends the cycle, I was thinking I'll get this and I'll go into a new, longer cycle which will make things easier for me, right? Well, that's not quite how it works, because somewhere else, I think in the codex or the tutorials, it says that you actually have to have a town adjacent to the seal. So when it says within embarkation range, it is actually lying, and somewhere else it does tell you the truth in the game. So to actually complete this cycle and unlock the longer next cycle, I need to make another town right next to the one I just made. And this time we're going to be in an interesting biome, albeit less interesting than it's supposed to be, because while I was playing this game, they updated it to make the biome that's around the seal area more interesting and more different from the regular towns. But this footage is from just before they did that update, so we're going to see the earlier version of the seal forest, and later we'll see the new and modern version of the seal forest, which is more interesting. So basically, it's time to make another town. This time, the trees are kind of brown, so that's different. Otherwise, let's just get the trees. And we're getting a more efficient early game build now, where we're not going to put down any houses. We're going to quickly put a road between the wood cutting area and the warehouse to speed up our wood cutting. And because we're taking extra people as our embarkation bonus every time, we have enough people to make 3 woodcutters' huts. I'll make the 3rd one in a second, and speed up our exploration. I'm also going to be putting down the crude workshop early on, I think it's called, the thing that turns wood into planks to rapidly speed up the early game production, because I was always running out of planks. I'm just going to be making planks from the beginning, even though I'm not building anything right now that needs them. We'll start stockpiling them immediately, and we're also not going to be taking my pulls. You can see towards the bottom left, I've got 2 buildings to unlock that I just haven't taken. This is the thing I mentioned earlier, where it might be better to explore the map for a while and then take the buildings, because realistically you're not going to make the buildings immediately unless it's a carpenter, as the carpenter takes over from the crude workshop for making your early game planks and does it better. And also it can make tools as well if you have the right resources, so the carpenter is one of my favourite buildings. But if you don't get that early on, then there's probably no point going through the pulls. Of course, you might have that in your 3rd pull, so you have to get the other ones out of the way to get that early game advantage of having the carpenter from the beginning. It's a gamble, isn't it? Well, I've decided that simply not looking at the cards is probably the best way to gamble. I should play poker or something. 10 minutes later, we're still sitting on our cards, and things seem to be going well. We're milking those lizards. Looks like it's storm time, so the milking season is over, unfortunately. But we don't have enough resources to need to do any particularly interesting production change, so I just don't need to take my building pulls. We can just do the basics for now. We've got the big shelter upgrade unlocked now. This is one of the very few straight-up improvements you can make to your deck. You can get a big shelter instead of a shelter, which is more space efficient, but requires planks instead of logs, so you have to do a little bit more production work to get them going, but you're almost always going to have plank production going on anyway. Eventually, let's take some cards and see what happens. This time I decided not to go with the farming build, because I could see there weren't many or any farming patches near where we started. I think they still can spawn on this map, but since we don't have them early on, we'll go without. Here I almost take the Carpenter, the legendary building, but go for the Brickyard instead. I was tempted by the allure of being able to make bricks, but then I take the Carpenter for my choice here instead. So with that we can make planks and bricks pretty effectively, 2 of the 3 basic resources that you need to make everything else. Then I'll take this lizard house to make my milking plan go a bit better later on, and we're set. I think it's fun to take all of your cards at the same time, because you can strategize a bit more easily. You have in your head your thoughts on what you're going to make in the future because you were just thinking about it, looking at the previous card, that sort of thing. So you kind of know what your build is and what your hand is a bit more, because your quote-unquote hand isn't always visible, I suppose. It's not always in my mind. Not that our build here is anything special. We're going to make the basic resources that you need to do basically everything. Well, that's a good build, isn't it? And I suppose it's an example of the sort of thing where you kind of wish you could just do that part of the game and save the RNG for something a little bit more exotic, perhaps, because it's frustrating to, say, not be able to get good brick production and be stuck with the basic brick production, because it's going to hold you back. It's supposed to be like that, you're supposed to deal with that in some way, but I suppose I don't enjoy that challenge, because you sort of know what to do, and it's not very fun to pull off the solution to that challenge. I don't know. Or you just hope that it's going to improve later in the stage, which it still might, and maybe that's a source of fun as well. What I'm actually doing right here is focusing on cutting space around the warehouse. This is something that I gradually got more and more into, because in this game you don't have any dedicated logistics people. The workers in production buildings have to go and get stuff from warehouses, so they're not producing while they're travelling, meaning there's a very obvious efficiency improvement available where just moving something closer to the warehouse will increase its efficiency by a huge amount. Like a thing that takes 20 seconds to make might also have 20 seconds of walking to and fro to get and deposit things. So putting the building right next to the warehouse increases efficiency by 100%, completely blowing out of the water any of the possible upgrades you can get through the unlockable upgrades back at the Smouldering City or through perks. So simply having a good road layout and focusing everything near the warehouses could be all you really need for the economy in this game. And I gradually got into that, starting to try and prioritize cutting space around the warehouse so we can have production be right next to it. And also you can put down more warehouses later to just increase the efficiency of everything. You can also do some real big-brained plays where, for example, with that brickyard, it's positioned in such a place that the clay, which is going to be going into the brickyard, is initially being stored right next to it in the stonecutters' huts. And I believe the brickyard staff will go to those closer huts rather than the warehouses first, to increase the speed at which the resources are being delivered in. So by doing that with all of the production chains, you can make a more efficient production line. I don't know to what extent that matters. Maybe it matters a decent amount if you play on the really high difficulties or something. Here I am selling off a whole bunches of boxes of something or other that I was able to make, mainly just to complete this mission right here, but also to get some cash. And as you might have seen, we bought a massive pile of jerky, so I'm probably thinking of going for more lizard milking. However, you can see the lizard's standards, the little blue thing next to the face on the left, have gone up. That means I've milked them too much and now I have to give them more. I think standards might also go up based on your economic productiveness or something. I can't quite tell. Either it's when people get too happy, they decide they want to be happier, or if your town reaches a certain size or something like that, they start to expect more of you and you have to do more to get the happiness points. There's some kind of thing in the background to try and balance out the happiness for points exchange system in the background, which you can probably play and exploit to some degree if you know precisely what it is that causes the limits to go up. We open up this Forbidden Glade, which also completes another mission, giving us a point, and the challenge in here is really easy. We can get a full point by exchanging 15 stone, which is just one of the things that spawns on the map, so we have loads of that and can get more whenever we need at the moment. So that's another easy point, and there are 2 piles of boxes in this glade. So we can use those to just get more easy points, because I've already got tons of tools. You saw me taking the carpenter earlier. The reward is that we have 30 tools, which is probably enough tools to open all of the boxes on the map if we just keep cutting through to discover more in the forest. And every time you do that, you get quite a lot of money and a decent amount of points as well. So we're about to gain like 3 to 4 points in total off that one glade, and that will shoot us through towards the end game effectively already. Looks like I'm cutting some space here because I'm planning on making my second town area in this Forbidden Glade, since there'll be a little bit of space. There's the small hearth going down. My thought, most likely, is I want to get hostility down. At the top you can see hostility is almost at level 2. If we can keep it at level 1, we'll have fewer problems. And also having a second hearth allows you to assign another person as a hearth keeper, one of the jobs. And if you put a lizard as a hearth keeper, you get +1 happiness to everybody, which is just a massive advantage because you're often 1 happiness away from something happening. So there's something to be said for building loads of hearths, just as many as you can, and then using all of the lizards to get loads of +1 happiness bonuses. I don't know if that actually works or whether they stack infinitely if you keep doing it. I don't know. In comes another trader. There's not much I really want from this trader right here. I've got tons of cash and tons of resources. We're doing really well in this stage. We don't need anything from this trader, and I think later in the game you can unlock more traders. So as you build up your smouldering city thing where you're spending food for perks, you'll eventually have more options here. As it stands, well, we wait until the next trader comes along, and then I blow all of my money on perks and coats as well. It's like happiness bomb time. Once you get towards the end of a mission, the economy stops mattering, and it's like you might as well just blow everything on getting as much happiness as possible. It doesn't matter if everything's going to fall apart because you're doing this, you just need enough happiness to leave. So we get incense and coats. The incense will go into one of our temple buildings to boost happiness on the humans and lizards. The humans are wearing the coats, and you can see the lizards and humans are both nearly at the happiness threshold, but I'm distracted once again. My head is in a different place here. I'm thinking about all of the economy side of the game, thinking about it as a city builder, I suppose. And this is what you need to not be doing in Against the Storm. This is a strategy game. You need to be thinking, what's the min-max plan to just leave as soon as possible? Don't think about your people. Don't think about the buildings. Don't think about the roads too much. Just try and get that blue bar to go up. And here, I'm wasting my time. All of this stuff I'm doing, like fiddling with the economy, trying to improve production lines, doesn't matter at all, because we're close enough to the end of the game that I just need to do something to get me out. And this is where the game's really leaning into being a speedrun game for all intents and purposes, where it's really about just knowing the game systems and exploiting your way out and trying not to think about things like immersion. Eventually, I remember the racism too late as usual. We need the racism alarm to go off when you could be more racist than you are already. We can be racist to either the humans or the lizards right now, and I think going for lizards is the superior choice just because there are more lizards. I think the amount of happiness you get is just based on how many there are, but I think also, because I've already been milking the lizards, the amount of happiness gain you get from them being happy might degrade over time, so maybe that means I should have gone for the humans. Essentially, we leave soon enough, so we made that town. It was going somewhere, that town, but all that stuff I was setting up, again, doesn't matter. I'm getting too drawn into the city building aspect of it. We just needed to leave, and we do leave, and that also completes the so-called Seal Forest. Later, we'll see the improved version of this staged concept, but in the original game that I started playing, it's just a normal stage for all intents and purposes, but there are no leaves on the trees, and it ended up being one of the easier stages, perhaps due to RNG, or perhaps I'm just getting good at the game by this stage. We leave. You have to end your cycle once you build a town next to a seal, so that's the end of that. The world flashes away, there's a big storm, and the storm not only destroys your town, but remakes the world in some way. I don't know what this storm was. Now the biomes are in slightly different places and there are different bonus areas around the map. And we start the game again. We're back at near the beginning of this video, looking at what to do. There's the green thing, it's still there. You can go and get it again if you want. Looks like you could get some more resources for doing so, but it seems like there's not much point. Maybe situationally that would be useful to go for if you happen to be close to it. We actually want to get the blue one, so there's one that's a bit further away. You can get another extra bunch of years added to the cycle duration. And I suppose you can see where they're going with this. You probably keep going further and further out, getting more and more time per cycle. And what I don't know is there something like on the edge? I suppose I don't feel like the game is indicating there is actually a reason to go out there. And we'll talk about that more later on, I suppose. For now, we're going to start the second cycle. We're starting again, so we're going to make our first town. And for this new cycle, which will be the last cycle I talk about in this video, I had a different idea at first, at least, for what I would do. I thought, since we are massively over-leveled, quote-unquote. We've unlocked loads of things that we can buy, but I've barely bought any of them because we were playing all those stages on easy. We don't have many resources, so we're kind of behind in the level-up tree, and everything about the game will get a bit easier if we go up the level-up tree and actually unlock all of the various plus 2% things, because like if you get it 5 times and there are like 10 of each upgrade available, it will start to matter and become significant later. So I thought I'm just going to play not on the lowest difficulties. If you play on just the second difficulty, triples your reward if I remember correctly, but it only makes the game slightly harder. So we've seen many towns so far where we were very prosperous, we were blasting forwards when the stage ended. If you move the difficulty up by 1, you only need to get 2 more points, which will almost certainly be trivially easy from the sorts of towns we've been seeing so far. So I thought what I guess I should do in the game is just make a ring of towns around the smouldering city in the middle, just playing it safe, just do loads of normal stages as fast as possible, and just grind out resources to unlock the various things, and then in the third cycle, I would go and try to just go in a straight line towards the blue thing to unlock the next thing and see what happens, that sort of thing. That plan got changed, as we'll see as we go along. However, there's another thing to mention, which is that after starting to grind, I realised I don't want to, because I suppose this is where I'm at odds with the game. You're supposed to like this part. It's a game very much based around playing these stages over and over again. It is, quite literally, a roguelike. And I suppose what I'm ultimately going to be saying is that I don't find the gameplay is quite enough to support the concept that the game should be just doing this over and over again. It's interesting to do, but it's not interesting to keep doing it and to keep starting again, which is probably where the developers have a completely different attitude, because they were advertising one of the positives of the game is that you get to start again. Like, isn't the start the best part of any city build? And I come at it from the other perspective, right? I like the end and sort of looking back on how all of the things you did progressed towards something, and then while you're doing that, while you're building your town, you're sort of foreseeing the advantage that will come from doing something later on. And in this game, it's less like that, as I was saying. You don't want to be thinking about long-term advantage and trying to set up production chains to do things, because you're trying to think about ending the stage as soon as possible. You just want to get anything that works down, as long as it gets you that one extra point of happiness to start milking those lizards, as we're doing right here. We actually have a pretty easy stage right here, because we found 2 farming patches instantly and we pulled the farm. So we can just go for the standard infinite grain build, try to get some biscuits through, and we'll be in business soon enough. Obviously, everything we've seen so far in these videos is going to repeat, so I'll try to cut things down a bit more as we progress towards the end of my campaign commentary. But basically, the fatigue is setting in here in the second cycle. Maybe you can feel it as well just by watching it. Things are just happening over and over again, in very much the same fashion as they were before. The building tree isn't wide or deep enough to be like, oh, I'm getting different buildings this time. There aren't that many buildings, and as I said, because the buildings all cross over each other, I don't think you could do something like that in this game, and, well, they don't want to, but to some extent they're forced to not want to do that as the developers, because if they did do that, a lot of players would end up in trouble because of the RNG nature of the game. You have to make it so that the game can't punish you too much for being unlucky. Well, I say that. You don't have to do that, it's just that people would complain unless you did that. So I imagine over time, because this is an early access game, it's been very influenced by player opinions. And I wonder if that has led to a bit of creep, where the player has become overpowered because the initial concept of how the game was going to provide challenges has had to be watered down because people were getting annoyed by it, which potentially just means the initial concept of a very RNG-based city builder might have flaws in it. Maybe you just can't make a satisfying game where it isn't fair at its core, or it can't be fair, so you have to start doing all of these little puppeteering moves behind the scenes to try and force it to be fair. The classic problem with all RNG games, they end up just lying to you because you can't make RNG work by the nature of it. For some amount of the player base, they'll have a bad time, not because of the game design, but because of the RNG. And the only thing you can do about that is to start walking back the RNG, inviting the question of why you walked forward the RNG in the first place. At least in my opinion. The number one RNG hater is back in the house. Yes, I actually developed a game heavily based around RNG. That's how much I hate it. I sort of made the game in the spirit of, here's a game that's RNG based, but a lot of the gameplay mechanics are things you can do to make it not RNG based, that sort of thing. Well, I just did it because Fire Emblem got away with it. I'm ranting once again. Let's try and speed through the rest of the game now, because we're getting the idea, I think, and we'll end up talking about my final attitude and thoughts on the game as we get to the end. And there are a few more mechanics to actually look at as well that haven't come up yet. One is potentially what I'm doing here. I'm trying to micromanage where people live. I don't think this matters that much for production efficiency, because the people don't go into their houses. But if people live near a hearth, it does track how many people are in the hearth's residence zone, and you have to have a certain number of people there to level up the hearth, which gives you basic bonuses. I think you get +1 happiness for the first level, and the second level gives you plus 10% production efficiency or something. So if you have multiple hearths, you want to spread the population out between them, and you can do something where you block people from being allowed to live in certain houses to try and force them to spread out across the town. So that's what's going on there. And I was doing it, by the looks of things, to complete a mission regarding that, and boom, we're already in the late game of this town. We've got the humans super happy, so we're milking the humans this time big time, and we have quite a lot of humans as well, so that's going to be paying off a lot in the long run. Looks like we've got some tools and some boxes to open, that's more free points. We are storming towards victory once again. We're able to progress nicely thanks to some easy missions like this one. It's very RNG based, of course, what missions you're going to get, but you want to look out for the missions that are essentially nothing. So that one was make some decorations, you can just do that trivially easily. Other good ones are make roads, explore glades, because you need to do that anyway, or any mission where it's just like distribute 30 clothes or something, and you might have been doing that anyway, so it's just free points. And then you get a reward for doing it as well, which usually makes you better at doing that thing. So it's another random aspect to the difficulty, where they have to give you enough missions that you probably will get a whole bunch of easy ones, but it's a case where I think it's less watered down than in other cases. You really can get lucky with the missions, and the stage overall will be easy as a result, or vice versa. We complete this one without actually finishing some of the stuff I was doing. I had 2 dangerous glades open at the end of the stage. I was probably going for more points from them, because they would have been full of boxes and challenges to get more points, but we finished it early. That was another case where I could have kept going and got more reputation points, and potentially looked for more reward if that had been an option. Unfortunately, quote unquote, we level up after this, so we've unlocked a few more buildings. And this could be good, could be bad. It's good in that it expands our production pool. We can now theoretically make more things, or have more options, have more chances to get that watering down effect, where one of the buildings we have might do the thing that we want. There are now more possible things we can do. But of course it means a specific building you want, a building that's good at doing something specifically, is less likely to come up. Here we grab what I think is probably the most important upgrade, and this tree is the most important tree, where it takes the human house out of the pool and you have it permanently. So this feels like forward progress in a roguelike RNG game. It's something that makes it less RNG-ish. We're starting to pull things out into our permanent deck. And I sort of wish you could do that for everything as you progressed, or most things. You can essentially do it for all of the houses, and you get better houses as well. And you also get more resources from the gathering points on the map if you take that chain up the right-hand side of the tree, which is just universally going to make the game easier. All of the other things are generally repeating bonuses, so it looks like there's lots of stuff to unlock. A lot of the time it's getting the same bonus over and over again, and they add up over time to something significant. We're not actually going to be doing that in this campaign, of course, so I suppose that doesn't matter too much to us. We're fine as it is. Now, my original plan to make a big circle around the centre town is out the window, because I realised we can make towns near the special tiles to get extra resources. But here was a very special tile. In this mission, you're not given any orders, the things I was calling missions earlier. Extra confusing with my commentary here. Basically, we're not going to be given any objectives, but that means we're not going to get any rewards for doing them, or any reputation points for doing them. And we were getting most of our reputation points through doing those things. So what do we do now? Well, we have to rely on the 2 other sources. The first one being happiness milking, the second one being finding stuff in the glades that happens to give you a reputation reward as the bonus for completing something, and happening to have whatever it is you need to complete it, the resource challenges, that is. The first one we find, unfortunately, only reduces hostility, which is still useful, but points are going to be more important in this mission. We do get lucky early on because we get an easy hostile event. One that doesn't cost any resources to solve. I'm going to have to take the solution that doesn't give me any points, but instead it gives me 5 extra people and a bunch of resources. And normally you'd get a load of extra people through completing missions, or I do, because I tend to take missions that give you more people to spiral up our productivity as early as possible. We can't do this now, so we have to rely on things like this, and more commonly you get a couple of extra people every year that goes by. But that means you have to wait a long time for people, and every second in the game you don't have somebody is a second of production lost, so you want to get everyone in as soon as possible. Therefore, we get lucky in that very early on we get a whole bunch of extra people for free. There's also this brick oven here. That means we can repair the building and start using it without having to pull the brick oven from our deck. That means we now have access to pie, coal and incense early on as well, without any of the proper production lines. Once we get all that going, that's going to be great, because pie and incense can both be fed into the humans to get extra happiness. And I was mainly going for human happiness, because I've just unlocked that human house. You can see I've put down loads of human houses early on. I'm going to focus on trying to make the humans happy, although they are hard to make happy. The second dangerous glade we open also has great stuff in it. There's a really easy challenge where we can just get a point immediately, a reputation point that is, and there was a carpenter in there, my favourite building. So now I don't have to pull the carpenter, and we can make loads of planks and make tools. And for this run, we're suddenly going to need tools. Tools is the thing that converts boxes to points for all intents and purposes. You can see all the boxes around the place with the little exclamation marks over the top of them. We've got like 6 or 7 unopened sets of boxes. So if we just get a tools economy going, that's just going to be a huge pile of points. Like at least 4-ish points would be coming in from just the boxes we can see right now. And we have the option to go and see more. So that's going to be another great source of points. You might also note we've got quite a lot of farmland, including farmland in the first glade, which is relatively rare, which makes this perfect for a human build. Here I am pulling out the monastery, a building we can use to convert incense to human happiness. I think lizard happiness would have gone up if we had lizards, but sometimes, for reasons I don't understand, your lizards get replaced by harpies, who are also an easy-to-please race, who have slightly different needs, essentially. Well, anyway, here I am taking some more humans on for the yearly influx of people. We want more humans the better for my human racism build. Looks like I was actually getting a bit of free happiness from the harpies there, because they are easy to please, as I said. But later, we finally get that human happiness up by adding in pies to the mix. Only just though, we still need more human stuff to keep this going. We'll get that monastery going soon enough. But yes, it's milking time now. We'll see how many points we get. What I still don't quite understand is how the diminishing returns works. I believe every time you get a reputation point through happiness, it gets harder to do it again. So there's some system where you can't farm happiness. That's on top of the other thing that stops you farming happiness, which is that the happiness threshold goes up and up over time, so it just gets harder to get any happiness out of people. Well, I don't know. There's some downside to this plan, but we're doing it in the correct order, quote-unquote, because say I wanted to explore the map first and look for reputation gaining points. Doing that would increase hostility and thus decrease the happiness of everybody. So the best way to get reputation, I think, without doing any orders, is first to keep things really conservative and just be in a small area, milking all the happiness out of people you can with the resources you have. And then only once you can't get anything else, start exploring the map again to look for more resources or more opportunities to get points. And that's essentially what we're doing in this stage. But we've still got a long way to go. We're dual milking the happiness right now from humans and harpies, and that's with no racism. So truly, we are approaching utopia here by just trying to make people happy. It can be done even without explicitly discriminating against particular races. I don't know. We'll have to go back to the political scientists on that one. Here we're going to use a little bit of industrial magic. Many buildings can be freely moved around. The game's super generous, doesn't charge you anything or cause any issues as far as I can tell to just move things. So you don't have to commit very much to your layout, and I find that probably overly forgiving. I thought I should be punished more for making a bad layout, but because you can move things around, like I just did there, we can make some space to slap something down that I needed. That was the bathhouse, I think, which you can use to get harpy happiness. We're slapping down more monasteries by the looks of things, trying to grind that incense for happiness. If I put more people in the monasteries, they would be more useful to me, but I'm tactically keeping people out of the monastery workforce. I'm not quite sure why, because I have tons of unemployed people. Maybe I'm trying to get a build to go through faster or trying to put down roads. I forget. Here we are towards the end, essentially, where we just keep going. We're starting to run out of opportunities to get that happiness. You can see the human happiness cap is now really high, so I just can't please them anymore. But what I can do now is cut towards the edges of the map. We're actually at the rightmost edge of the map here on this screen, looking for more boxes and more stuff. There was a big box in the corner there, and now and again you'll get a dangerous glade event, which just gives you a free point. And because my economy is pretty good in this setup, and we have the trader constantly bringing in more stuff, we don't have to worry about dangerous glades for all intents and purposes. We'll almost certainly have the resources we need. We're also just about skimming below the hostility threshold to keep happiness up, and I even was at hostility 0 almost at the very end of the stage, which probably would have given me an achievement. I also had everybody's happiness in the blue at the end of the stage, but I think the numbers hadn't gone up yet to the relevant numbers, so the picture glows blue before you actually reach the correct number. It's just glowing to mean you are going to reach the correct number. And I think I would have got an achievement if I'd completed the stage when they were all at the correct number, which would have been seconds away, but unfortunately something went through, perhaps a box opening or something, and we complete the stage suddenly. So it's another case where it's like this stage was going really well. I was about to cash in big time. Another dissatisfying ending, where it's like, oh, everything I worked towards, it didn't matter in the end. And it's because I'm playing on easy difficulty again. I switched it back down to easy, because I thought we need that lower reputation score goal to get through the challenge of not having orders. But I think in retrospect, you don't. It was working well enough without any orders. It was just taking longer in real life. Luckily, I'm cutting things out, so you don't have to worry about that. So that's another town done, although my plan to grind failed a little bit because we were distracted doing that challenge on easy difficulty. After that, we've got another town with a potential bonus right here where we can get some extra special resources, so we might as well go for that, and this time, looks like we are going to switch back up to grinding mode. We'll make it a little bit harder. Potentially not only for the experience points, but for the fun, for the satisfaction of getting the end game. The easy difficulty seems to keep cutting off just when things are getting good, just when everything comes together at the end and you think you're going to rush through the last few points. The game's over. And it seems I'm mad about that, even though that's an intentional part of the design. They're trying to get you to go for the higher difficulty first. I just feel like I should be allowed to go through all of the objectives in order if I want and leave when I want. Yes, it's the man playing a roguelike saying that he wants more player choices. Well, I suppose we're just in the wrong neighborhood here. I suppose the game gives you fine enough choices, but I was dissatisfied by the dangling possibility that I could have made some better ones if I really had free choice. I'm too good for roguelikes, too high and mighty, and as a sign of my benevolence, for this mission I'm actually going to take the harpies and beavers instead of the humans, even though taking just humans would have given me more people right off the bat, so this is the inferior choice as far as I can tell. Maybe I was thinking of milking the harpies, I just don't quite know at this stage. I think the resources you get for taking humans are probably more useful as well. Hard to say. There's probably some kind of big-brained strategy going on. I felt like I was always thinking about things throughout this game, which is why it's very compelling. There's always something new to think about, always a new decision to make. It's just that it doesn't matter very much in retrospect, a lot of the time. But it certainly feels like it does, and I suppose that's technically all that matters. You'll get good reviews at the very least, so that's something. Today we're in the Red Forest. The Red Forest is actually more different to the other forests because it comes with a unique building, the Archaeologist's Office, which I'm trying to make here. Not that it's going to be of any use to me. It's something you can use, I guess, to get some fossils, I guess, at some point. So I started going for something like that. The reason why we don't actually get any of that in this gameplay footage is because of this message that pops up after a while. I came back one day and they've updated the game in such a way that it breaks saves, and I thought I was absolutely screwed here, but it turns out that it's just the save that's in the town. Your save out on the world map is preserved. So we end up just going back to before I started that town in the Red Forest, and I thought, well, I might as well actually go for the seal now, because this was the update where it was about the fact they've changed how the seals work. So I thought, I guess if I'm going to see that, I might as well go for the seal, and I figured I probably do actually have enough time to go there because we've sort of started going towards it already by chance. So the entire grind plan is out the window. I'm actually going to go for the game's objective, I suppose. So, we're starting another town. Here it is. And the only real point to make about this is it's getting to the stage when I was really feeling the fatigue, I guess, of starting again. I think I mentioned this before earlier, that the developers were hyping up the fact the game is about starting again. I guess I just don't value the start as much as I'm supposed to or something. Like, I find the start is the beginning of something interesting, but I know that it isn't now, because I know that what I build here will be deleted quite shortly, probably within the same gameplay session that I'm sitting down to do. So I sort of feel a little bit pulled out of it, and when I see the opening clearing and have to start doing the initial build order again, it's like, oh, this again, huh? Like, I'm doing it again. Didn't I just do this, like, just now? The starting again is too rapid and too similar, I think, even with all of the RNG added in. Well, anyway, time to buy some tools at the first possible opportunity for this map, because that's the new meta for me, really. Just get tools as soon as possible, take all of the free points you get from having tools, and that unlocks more buildings, which makes everything easier, so the sooner you do that, the better. And it all just spirals into a positive feedback loop of you getting points more and more easily, earlier and earlier, so you can get out of the stage earlier and do more stages. Pretty sure that's what we're supposed to be doing, and I'm pretty sure I ended up doing it at some point. But I'm not sure how much I enjoyed it. I feel like I was always really in the zone while playing, like it's really compelling. There's so many things to do constantly, so much to think about. But then I always get pulled out when I realise I shouldn't have been thinking about those sorts of things. Like, all of these production lines that I was getting invested in trying to set up, you often don't need them at all, and of course by the end of things it all gets deleted and you just have to do it again under slightly different circumstances. I felt like I was never getting a payoff from the effort I was putting into the game, I suppose. But again, we are playing on easy difficulty, which limits the extent to which you can get a payoff for playing well. But we do need to keep it on easy, because we are going for the seal run. I need to get the towns done as quickly as possible. So I'm sort of just going through a whole bunch of boring towns here to see what the objective's going to be. Not quite necessarily to my plan and not to my liking. Here was a special town you could make where if you do it with only one dangerous glade being open, then you get bonus tools for the rest of the towns you make this cycle. And you know I want to feed my addiction to tools. If we had tools from the very beginning of the stage, you often find a couple of boxes early on that you can't open, like during the first year of the game, but if you could do that, you'd get points and extra buildings really early on, which would probably go a long way to getting your happiness up earlier when the standards are low, and getting your production lines more efficient earlier, so you end up getting more stuff over the course of the run, and just generally making the game easier overall. So I was well in to come and get this bonus thing. And, well, the stage just goes normally again, and you can see me looking like I'm immersed in what's going on. I'm doing all sorts of things. I'm thinking about lots of things. There's always so much to think about and sort of the puzzle to do again. And I find it compelling to do it, I suppose, when I'm there. But as I said, I then come away and think, but was it good? I feel like somehow I'm being tricked into having fun, but I guess that's what video games are for. I'm not quite sure what I'm complaining about. I suppose I just wanted there to be more substance to all of the stuff. Like, I think the stuff you do in the game is all quite good and quite fun, but it's also more pointless than in the average game because it is explicitly taking away from you everything that you achieve as part of the game. And on that topic, I suppose, I got absolutely obliterated in the last, second of the stage, because a woodcutter's camp that I'd forgotten about was randomly cutting down trees, and it randomly got itself into a dangerous glade here. So I don't complete the challenge, since I'd already done one earlier. And that means this was a suboptimal stage. It actually doesn't matter, and I had calculated beforehand that even if I fail this stage, it doesn't matter. The reason being that I'm still within the same number of turns worth of movement range from the objective, whether or not I do this stage, or skip over the bonus tile and have this stage be a bit closer to the objective already. It would have taken the same amount of towns to do it. So it doesn't matter, but that was very disappointing, unfortunately. Have to pay attention to those forgotten woodcutter camps, that they are still cutting down trees here and there, and not following necessarily your schema where you tell them what trees to cut down. So, time to do that again. Let's make another town, this time a bit closer to the objective. Again, and well, it just keeps happening. And I suppose there was this building dread of sorts, like every time you'd see the start screen, just be like, we're doing it again. There's so much happening, so much random stuff to go through, like to look at your objectives and see what's in the glades. There's kind of something to play for, even right in the beginning. But I found it less and less satisfying, I suppose, as the mystery wore off and I kind of knew what it was going to be. And I knew that ultimately, the puzzle is a little bit illusory. I suppose this is the watering down point I keep mentioning in this video. Like, you know you are going to solve the puzzle even though it's unseen in advance, because they've made it such that you will be able to solve it. I don't think it's guaranteed like in the code, like it always gives you what you need, but the game is made such that you're extremely rarely not going to have something that you need or some way to do the thing that you want to do. And I think this is actually what it said in the tutorial. It had this sort of cryptic message at the end being like, you're going to face some difficult scenarios, but just keep trying because there's always a way to get through it. And I think that's a good spirit to have in this game, because early on I was a bit baffled by like, how can you have an RNG based city builder game? And later, looking back on it, it's like, yes, there is always a way to solve it somehow. Like, even just opening up a new glade or cutting down more of the map will reveal some new thing if you're really sure what you have right now can't solve whatever problem you have. Well, something. There's something about Against the Storm that I don't like. I'm not quite sure what it is, because it doesn't even seem to be the gameplay. I quite like the gameplay. It just has a sort of pointless feel to it, in the same vein as Into the Breach that I commented on recently. I have this feeling where I like the game, but I feel like it's not going anywhere, or I know it's not going anywhere, so I don't feel compelled to play it. Like, I know I've already seen most of the stuff in the game, like right at the beginning. And I suppose that's just a downside of the roguelike design, or this kind of roguelike, because of course you can compare it to something like Hades, I don't know, the good roguelike, a roguelike where there is actually content to get to that's not in the beginning. So in Hades' example, there's like a plot and significant gameplay changes you can make as you go along. Whereas here, I don't know, I just keep making the same town over and over again, just making it faster and faster, more and more optimally, but it doesn't matter that I'm getting better at doing it. And I just sort of feel like there are too many different things compelling me to have a bad time in a game that I feel like is supposed to be good for me. Like, I'm supposed to like this. I feel that I like it, but something is holding me back. Well, whatever it is, I'm not very good at describing it off the cuff at the very least. There's some problem here. You, write in the comments what my problem is. That would solve problems for both of us if you could work that out. Here's me picking my favourite perk. Decided to make a clip of that in this video for some reason. There's one perk, where you get +1 happiness if you take it, and increased villager speed as well. Just a universally good perk, which I contrast to a lot of the perks which are very situational and not especially useful a lot of the time. And we are milking happiness in this stage as a result. I think I was also doing some micro earlier, switching around who was the Hearth Keeper, because you get extra happiness if it's a lizard who's the Hearth Keeper as well. I remember in this stage I was going for an early happiness build, trying to get the lizards in as soon as possible, and my big tactical decision was like, should I make a house in the first year instead of the second year, which is the strategy I'd sort of settled upon earlier in earlier towns. Well, you know, I'm having a fun strategic time coming up with new builds, but it straight up doesn't matter, so let's just skip over it, and I suppose that's a comment to be made. Here is the thing I was actually trying to do. We've made it to the seals, and now we can see the newest addition to the game, the new Seal Forest challenges. So we're going to start off with a nice populous start. I can take extra people for my embarkation bonus, and one of the caravans you start with comes with 2 extra people. So we're going to start with like 11 or 12 population, enough to do not only the 3 woodcutter start that I usually go for, but perhaps even the 4 woodcutter start, or 3 and a decently staffed crude workshop. I'm really into getting a good early game off, although I don't think those resources I picked there were that useful. Should have gone for the clay or something instead. Well, anyway, I'm getting pretty good, I guess, at playing like the first half an hour of an Against the Storm town, but I'm not very good at playing anything else, because that's all that's happened to me so far, and it's really ground me down. But here we go into something a bit different. Not only are we finally escaping easy difficulty, so there's more to it in this stage, but there's more to it for an actual content reason. This stage plays, well, I'm going to say differently. If you want to be honest, really, it's actually added something the game already had. It just now has more of it. We'll see what I'm talking about in a second. You be the judge of whether this counts as new content. That point reminds me of something I was going to say earlier, which is I noted this game has extremely good reviews. It's at like 95% on Steam, so it's like one of the best games on Steam right now. And I was at first kind of confused because I saw that, went into the game and thought this isn't a 95% game. Like, I feel like people would be repelled from this or get bored of it quite quickly or something. And the achievement data somewhat supports that, if I recall correctly. Like, a certain amount, like 60% of players had done one town or something, which isn't that much for a game where you're expected to do loads of towns over and over again. Like, I've gone further than most people would go in this game, and you can go way further than I've gone. So that just sort of conflicted to me with the idea that this is a really highly reviewed game and a very loved game. I had two sort of points that came to mind about that, so before we talk about this final stage, let's just throw in another rant that comes to mind right now. The 2 points were, is the game getting better reviews because it's sort of a cult classic kind of game? A game where, sort of following on from that achievement thing I just said actually, if people who probably aren't going to like the game very much and are going to be disappointed by it leave early enough that they can get a refund, early enough that they don't feel they've sort of been screwed over or had anything taken from them, they're less likely to leave a disappointed review. So you want a game that's quite abrasive up front, and this ties into my impressions of the tutorial. The tutorial gives you the wrong idea for the game, and then it gives you that hint saying, this is going to be hard, but try to get through it somehow if you can, and then you hit the real game and it's sort of different to the tutorial, and you are conflicted with the RNG nature of the game, and you realize you're not going to be able to do what it just told you in the tutorial to do. You have to find a way to do it yourself, and you can imagine a lot of people just being like, oh, okay, never mind, like it's not the game I thought it was going to be, and just leaving. And maybe that is what happened with the achievement data. Although that said, it's also really normal for loads of people to leave a game early on, so losing 40% of the players in the first hour isn't necessarily a bad thing, because almost every game's going to lose like 10 to 20% in the first hour anyway, just because people played it by mistake or something, or straight up didn't have their tastes catered to by the game and just left immediately. Well, I don't know, it's because it's a game where you're expected to play a really long time to get anywhere. It was surprising to me that almost nobody has played very far. Like, I'm here in the sort of 20% group of people who went through, so I'm looking back and seeing that 80% of people didn't get this far, like haven't done as many things in the game as I've done, and I feel like there's so much I didn't do. Like, there's so much of the progression tree ahead of me. The massive list of achievements you're supposed to get it, experience points is so long, and I just haven't done any of them. I don't know. There's something going on with this game that might actually be factoring into its audience not liking it as much as the review scores suggest. That's what I was trying to say. And part of the explanation, I think, was that cult classic thing I mentioned. And the other thing is that this is what you could call a good early access game. The legendary thing has occurred where the early access plan was laid out in advance, as far as I can tell, and they've stuck to it. So I've played a lot of early access games so far where they've been in early access for years and years, and they've made very gradual progress over that time. I think Timberborn was one of those, to give an example that's like Against the Storm as well. What else was there? There was Ultra Kill recently that I complained about. That's been in early access for years. There was Star Sector. That's been in early access for a decade, although I think that one's at least nearly done, so that's something. I think with Against the Storm, it's been in early access for less time than that. I can't remember the exact time, but it might even be like 1 year, and they've nearly finished it. So it had this really professional early access where they actually had like a set amount of things they were going to do, and they've got an entire development team actually working on it. So they released it 1 year before it was done, but because of the nature of the game, it was still relatively done during that 1 year. They've just sort of spruced it up and finished it off, added tutorial stuff, made the UI neater. So while I guess it's still afflicted by the curse of early access, it's still worse to have played the game in the past. Like, everyone who played it so far was screwed. You should have waited, and if you played it now, you would have had a better time. But it's not as bad as it usually would have been for an early access experience. And I feel like people are rewarding the developers for that with good reviews, because I seem to see a lot of people in the reviews talking about how the developers were really positive, were really professional, and were getting the job done, and that players liked that. And I wonder if the game is riding on that high, and that one day it will be more negatively reviewed because of the actual game design being not necessarily to everyone's tastes and a little bit countercultural in its genre, you could say. I don't know. Well, I can't really talk about this because I am the man who doesn't like roguelikes, and gamers like roguelikes, and I will never understand why. I always feel like you sacrifice something when a game is a roguelike, and you always get a worse version of the same game concept. I feel like with a roguelike, the good thing is the promise, like the idea that here's a clear-cut goal where you can grind, where you can get better at something. But I always find it's not necessarily fun to be like that, and it's arbitrary because the gods of that world, the developers, could have just made it so that something different happens instead of the same thing happening as you grind. So like you could grind your way through Final Fantasy VII, you'll find that new content is being unlocked over and over again. You're not just making the Midgar part easier by doing it over and over again, something like that. Well, who knows? There's no point getting into this rant. I have no concrete thoughts other than that. Couldn't life be better in some way? Maybe it actually can't because I haven't thought it through. Well, that's what I think about Against the Storm. It could probably be better in some way. I'm in the camp where I thought I really like it, but I don't want to play it very much. The same thing with Into the Breach. It just feels like it's missing something, like it was a missed opportunity in some way. Let's talk about this stage instead. We're in the new content, and indeed something is different. You might have noted there's a little pylon pointing in a direction in this stage. That direction is the way you need to chop. So this time it's not random, like how the map is generated. There's something to chop towards. So let's chop towards it and otherwise build the town as normal for now. Here's a couple of new things. First, we've got the Beacon Tower building here, a permanently unlocked building, which I think you can only make on this stage, which we'll see in action later. It's something quite interesting, I think, actually. There was something I wanted to say about that building. But first, it says on the left, there's a plague of mosquitoes. And I was like, what? I'm looking around thinking, is there a plague of mosquitoes? Well, basically, on the Seal Forest now, you get an extra problem with each storm season. So there'll be a plague of something during the storm season to make things a bit worse than normal. So on top of the usual happiness debuff. Normally it does tell you what it is. For some reason this first time it happened to me, it didn't tell me when I put the mouse over it. I think you have to put the mouse over a certain part of the alert message to get the message about what it actually does. Well anyway, it ends with no problems in this case. Once the first trader shows up, it's time to buy some porridge, because I'm going for some human happiness build here. We've already got the human houses down, so adding the porridge should push them over the edge with a bit of racism as well. However, in the Seal Forest stage now, getting your max happiness doesn't complete the stage, so while you still need to do it to unlock buildings, it's not as important to rush down the happiness as before. Here's a convenient mission: get some human happiness and some wheat, and wheat is the build I'm going for already. And here's another convenient mission: get some wheat and get more humans. So like, these things are a nice synergy, I suppose, to get those two at once. We've got some easy points coming in for some new building unlocks. But yes, it doesn't matter quite so much to get the reputation points. All you have to do is complete the thing that won't happen until we chop towards the place that the pylons are pointing towards. So things are going well, but it doesn't matter quite so much as it usually does. We also buy some clothes when the next trader comes along, so we're still going for those human points. The problem I was having though with this stage was a lack of the basic economy stuff. I didn't have a good enough supply of planks, bricks and fabric. I didn't get the buildings I wanted with the early card pulls, so we're stuck with the rubbish production of those things which you need for everything else. So it's happening very slowly. There's a little bit of a lack of raw resources as well. Need to micro where our people are working to make that work a bit better, I suspect. But you can see we've got unbuilt things all over the place. Also, there's a slight thing to remember, I suppose. Sometimes you can actually make a resource that it says you don't have the resources for, because by default the alternative recipes are disabled, and that was the case there with fabric. I could turn some leather I had into fabric, which is much more useful than leather, but by default your people won't do that unless you tell them to do it, whereas they will do it with like plant fiber. I suppose certain things have other higher priority uses in the game's meta, so it's trying to stop you making a mistake by having it automatically do it, but in this case it was a mistake to not automatically do it, so I was missing out there, and I'm going to blame somebody else. All of my mistakes are somebody else's fault. I hope you understand that. You probably do. So let's look at another mistake that somebody else must have made. I started doing this Dangerous Glade event, where I had to give some planks to a thing to get some stuff and get rid of a debuff. The debuff we're going to have while trying to do that is that you get a massive happiness penalty all the time. But because we don't have the planks ready right now to complete the challenge, I thought I'll just stop doing it until I'm ready. However, the happiness debuff from starting it stays until you complete it. So we're screwed over here. We've got this huge debuff where we can't get rid of it until we get a certain number of planks. I can't get the planks because I have to wait some time for that to happen. And while that time is passing, we're going to start losing population because the happiness debuff is so large that our happiness is going below 0. As we can see now, when things got really bad, we've got the beavers and the lizards below 0, even outside of the storm season, so things are going very wrong right here. We need those planks fast, and I'm looking at the carpenter thinking, can you do this faster? You actually can influence it to make it go a bit faster, because sometimes the planks sit in storage in the production building for a while, and you can forcibly move them to the warehouse to potentially speed up the production line. With a bit of racism, we can get the lizards back on board, in exchange of course for making the beavers be less on board, but they're not on board already, they're leaving, they're trying to get off this board. So now maybe they're getting off faster, I'm not quite sure if going really far below 0 does anything. Essentially, we just start taking the hits here, we start losing beavers. You can see there's like a red ring around the beaver that gradually depletes, and every certain amount of time you lose that citizen, which means you lose their production as well. We have to immediately restaff the carpenter. So you can see that's a potential downward spiral where the fact that your people are unhappy can cause you to stop being able to make them happy again. So you need to make sure this doesn't get too bad, essentially. We've got ourselves a good old-fashioned positive feedback loop here. And because it was still going to take a couple of minutes to complete the resource challenge even after getting the resources, because your people have to take the resources there and then do something to make the challenge go away, we're up for losing all of our beavers essentially at this stage. So I'm starting to think, should I use the beacon tower? We saw me there for a second looking at the beacon tower menu, and one of the options is to make the event resolutions happen faster. So that might cause me to not lose all of my beavers, that's the thought. I actually held off on doing it for a while, but you'll see in a second I do go ahead with that plan. I suppose I was trying to save it for some other situation where I would need it, but this is certainly a situation where we need it. I wanted to say about the beacon tower thing, where essentially it's a list of random perks you can take temporarily just whenever you want. That's how an against the storm of my anti-RNG vision would look. It's like an interesting step in that direction for them to add right at the end, a sort of hint of a different world, where it's less about RNG and it's more about decisions. So, for example, instead of getting random perks, you have something exactly like the beacon tower, where you're allowed to take a certain number of perks, maybe at a certain time or for a certain amount of time, and you just strategically, from your list, pick what you need to do something specific, which is what we're going to be doing right here with the beacon tower. And of course the same thing would apply with buildings. With buildings, I'd probably say if you want to make an Against the Storm-like game that's not random, it would just be a limitation on the number of buildings you can make rather than what buildings you are given. You could get a very similar challenge economically, where you still need to have buildings that produce multiple things in different efficiencies. All that would work the same. It's more like there's some penalty if you make more than 5 buildings, and your reputation point gain is allowing you to make a new building. I feel like it would be vaguely the same game, but just not RNG based and easier to learn. And well, I just want to be able to look at the building tree. Like, I don't like that I don't even really know what buildings are in the game, because you're drawing cards from this deck, but you never see the deck. It's probably in the codex somewhere or something like that. I just don't really know what's going on, of course, and we're going to blame the RNG. As long as we're blaming someone that's not me, it doesn't matter. And blaming RNG is always a safe option, because you can't, as I said earlier, make an RNG game that's going to cater to everybody by the nature of it. Somebody has to have a bad time because of the RNG. Against the Storm works very hard to minimise the number of people by sort of undermining its own RNG mechanics to some extent. I still think you could make basically the same game, but without the RNG. Well, let's leave the game design rants for another time. There's probably something to what I said there, but I'm not even going to think about it. We eventually solved that problem I had. Now we're going to build out into this Forbidden Glade and get things back on track. People are happy again, extra farmlands unlocked, so that's going to help out with my human happiness build I'm going for. A bit later, things are looking good. Now here's an important decision. I need to decide whether to take the monastery or the temple. Both are a key part of a human happiness build. However, I went for the temple instead of the monastery. Why is that a problem? Because of what I picked afterwards. Here, I'm going to take the brewery. The brewery is a great pick for when you have loads of excess wheat, which we will have in this build because we have tons of farmland. So, we can make ale and get happiness through ale. However, because I took the temple instead of the monastery, a very similar looking and functioning building, I'm not going to be able to use that ale that I will eventually be getting, and that's going to cause problems later. I essentially had in my mind a confusion between the temple and the monastery. One of them distributes ale to people and one of them doesn't, and they both distribute religion. So it's okay to have the temple, it would have been better to take the monastery, and this time, I'm not sure if I'm blaming myself. I'm going to blame the fact that the temple and the monastery look very similar and are sort of the same thing, but have a slightly different function. That in this case is going to screw me over. Although, because I took the brewery after making that decision, I don't know, maybe I should have kept in mind that I couldn't take the brewery because I just missed the thing that the brewery would have been used alongside. Something. If only I'd seen the production lines out on the screen somewhere, it might have been easier to make that decision. There we go, there's something we can blame. Anyway, all that aside, looks like the thing is happening. We cut through to the area that we were being pointed towards, and this is the real challenge of the Seal Forest. You don't win by getting points, as I said, you win by completing 4 missions. Perhaps I should say 4 orders, to stick with the game's language. We have challenges that are similar to the orders it usually gives you, where you get a reward for doing a thing. This time, if we do it a bunch of times, we'll be rewarded by completing the stage, so it's a different way to get out of the stage, and this is just the big difference really with the Seal Forest. So that's why I said it's kind of something that's already in the game. It's not necessarily a new mechanic, it's just another thing where you complete a resource challenge, but this time you don't get points, you get the ability to leave. Something new, I suppose, but not especially new. I enjoyed it because it is at least a bit different to what's normally happening. It's just functionally the same in that it's a bit like playing a normal stage, just with some new missions added in. If the update had been, we doubled the number of possible missions you could get, that would probably be more content than this, because this only happens on this one map. Once again, it's Devon playing a game where he wants everything to be slightly different in some way. This always happens, there's no escape from this reality. Let's talk about what's happening right here. I'm going to make some packs of provisions. The reason for making those is to use a mechanic that I've had available for a while that I haven't bothered to use, because you have to make packs of provisions in order to use it. It's that specific of a mechanic, so we'll see that in a sec. The other thing I wanted to say about these new orders, I suppose, the ancient seal thing towards the top right. What I didn't realise is that when it gives you the 3 goals, you only have to do one of them to quote-unquote progress, and you'll get a different set of 3. So it's similar to when you get given orders, you pick an order to do, and then only that order is shown in the list. So here it's more like all 3 of the things you could do are shown all the time, so you could start doing one and then switch to doing another if it suddenly became easier for some reason, so you've got a bit more freedom here. It's a little bit easier in that regard, it's just that the challenges themselves tend to be a bit harder than the regular missions. And I was setting up to do all of them when I first saw the set of 3. I was like, okay, I need to do all these 3 things to complete the first stage, and I thought there'd be 4 stages of doing 3 things. But it's actually you do 4 things, just picking one from each stage. Obviously that's going to become clear to me by the second stage, but at first I was setting up and buying and trading things and trying to readjust my economy, ready to do all 3 of the things at the same time, thinking, oh, this is going to be difficult, we need to do all of this stuff at once. But it's easier than I thought, and I probably wasted some resources setting up to do the things I ultimately wouldn't need to do as well. Here's what those pack of provisions do. With packs of provisions, you can trade both the packs and then something else to the previous towns you've made during the cycle to get some money. So it's an alternative way to sell things to the usual trader. Although you don't get to choose what you're selling a lot of the time, it's more reliable in that the trade offers are there more than the trader is. The trader's very rarely actually available. So trading things to your previous towns is nice, and it means the more towns you've made during a cycle, the more options you'll have there. So there is some purpose to making towns, which I really liked. This is the different direction the game didn't go down, where again it's hinting at that direction by having the start of the mechanic where I'm like, yes, that's where I want the game to have gone. Something where each town depends in some way upon the previous town, so that the town isn't just effectively gone once you leave the stage. Something about what you did in the town will contribute to what's going on in future towns, so there's more feeling like you are doing something in the long term as you achieve things, and from a sort of immersion or plot point of view, that everything is less pointless and gets deleted less. It's more like you're rebuilding civilization and you're feeling the rewards of doing something well before later. Not necessarily what you're going to get from a roguelike, but it is what I would expect to get from a city builder, and that's part of why I try to actively deconnect my brain from the concept that this is a city builder, because the city building gameplay loop, I suppose, begins but never continues. And the continuation part is the important part of the city building gameplay loop. In my opinion, as I said, clearly the developers explicitly stated that they think the opposite, so I'm in the wrong game, clearly. But you know what the good news is? City builders still exist, so we don't have to be that mad about Against the Storm, I suppose, because while I didn't necessarily like the new thing it's doing here, or, well, I wouldn't say I dislike it, I just wish everything was a little bit different and then I would have liked it a lot more. Same sort of thing I say about a lot of games, where some small problem has a big impact in my opinion, and I get frustrated at how easy it would have been to solve it. I'm the sort of player that when given the option to mod a game, will usually do it. It's just on this channel, I tend to not mod things deliberately, so that I can complain. We're trying to be some sort of critic here, a critic of what the developers presented, rather than what the developers made available to you. Like, if you do some extra work, you can have more fun, but that's probably true of virtually any game, even ones that don't have mod support. So, in some sort of journalistic way, I'm like, well, Against the Storm's not good enough for me, but I still want to play it. I would play it more if I wasn't being a pedant and wasn't feeling like I had to move on to other games. I wasn't constantly enraptured by this sort of productivity complex. I mentioned this in a previous video and someone was like, it's just a Protestant work ethic or something. I don't know, maybe I was infected by that. I did actually go to Christian school back in the day. But I feel that if there's no sort of point to the mechanic, like it's not going to do something later, there's not some long-term compounding advantage to playing a certain part of a game, then I don't want to. I'm not able to have fun. Yes, the man who can't have fun is back at it again with this entertainment commentary. You know you're going to get good content out of this. Well, anyway, I don't know why I'm ranting about this right now. Here's my final thought on Against the Storm, but not at the end of the game. I thought it was pretty good, and I wished that I wanted to play more. The same deal with Into the Breach. Needs more content. Although with Into the Breach, I fundamentally liked the mechanics. Here with Against the Storm, I feel like I don't like the design, or I shouldn't like the design. I'm like, why is it RNG? I just wish it was more normal, like the same game, the same concept, but more normal. And then I think, well, I wish it wasn't a roguelike, and very quickly I'm wishing that it wasn't Against the Storm. So I'm in this confusing position where I'm like, yeah, I like this game. The only thing I would change is this, and eventually I've listed everything about the game. So do I even like the game if I want to change everything about it? I don't know. Let's just keep going with the mission. There's some kind of Ship of Theseus style thing that I was just ranting about after listening back to it the next day. If you change every mechanic about Against the Storm, is it still Against the Storm? Well, probably not. Depends on your Ship of Theseus ideal solution. Mine is that it was never the Ship of Theseus. I like to be countercultural like that and be like, ooh, it was a linguistic construct the whole time. Well, the linguistic construct of what Against the Storm is could be applied to a future Against the Storm-like that I have designed in my imagination. It's called Perpendicular to the Storm. It's like this, but it's much more deterministic and player strategy driven or something. And the cities stick around for a longer time so that it feels a bit more like a city builder, I guess. Something. There is actually a game that's very similar to the game I'm imagining. There's a game in real life called Against the Storm. Hey, it's on the screen right now. Let's have a little comment on that, why don't we? Looks like I completed one of the challenges, so of course now I realise the other challenges go away when you complete one, thus implying you only need to do one from each thing. So that's going to be easier right now. A bit of the pressure is taken off to know we don't have to do all of these things, which is good because we're not even guaranteed to be able to do all of these things. Like that second challenge there, where I need to find an empathy decision to make. That's very RNG based. Sometimes there is an attribute attached to a decision you make in a resource challenge, where it will be called something like loyalty, because the theme of the event is such that there's a loyal choice and a corrupt choice or something like that. In my vague experience of the game, while that's always been there in the background, it has absolutely no effect on anything except occasionally you get like a perk, where it's like you get a bonus thing if you make a loyalty decision. I haven't been paying attention to that mechanic at all, so I just presume it's not important because I've never been punished for not paying attention, and I've never really noticed it come up on the screen either, so I couldn't even remember a case when I made a decision based on those attributes. And, well, I'm just saying that I wouldn't have wanted to do that goal if you had to do all of the goals, but you don't, so let's just not do it and do one of the other goals. That's the luxury we have. For this one, we'll go for the first challenge, which was to sell 50 ambers worth of stuff at the same time. So that's easy enough. When the trader shows up, we just start dumping the entire inventory of the town onto the trader until it's worth that amount. Annoyingly, we can only actually get 40 money for our more than 50 money's worth of stuff because of the trade imbalance going on. A perfect situation to be confused, where it's like, okay, I'm selling more than 50 ambers worth of stuff, but I only traded it for 40 amber, so does that count as completing the get 50 amber in a trade mission? Well, it was more like it had to be worth 50 amber, even if you didn't get 50 amber, so we did the thing. Now it's time to move on to the next thing, and for this one we're doing the middle one because we've basically already done it, where you have to provide services, food and housing. We're way over the housing cap already. The services thing, that's where the ale problem that I was alluding to earlier came in. We would have already done this mission if I'd been able to serve ale. You can see if you look really closely towards the top left, there's a little number over the ale icon while the icon is grey. That means I've produced loads of ale but nobody can drink it because we don't have the building in which you're allowed to drink it. So that was why I was screwing myself over. I've wasted tons of production and tons of resources making something I can't use because I was always just holding out like eventually I'll be able to use it, and I never was. And here, well, it matters even more because we would have just shot through that objective if I'd been able to do that. Luckily, providing religion also counts, and we do have incense production somewhere. And that temple I took by mistake earlier will be able to do that for us. Thus meaning this is a goal that we'll just naturally complete without actually having to do anything. So that's handy. Looks like we also maxed out the reputation points, but as mentioned, that doesn't do anything here. I was hoping it would give me a building unlock so I could still get that ale going through, I suspect, but unfortunately not. So we do the thing, time for the next thing. For this one, we're going to go for the final goal because we'd, again, already mostly done it. It was get loads of money and get loads of luxury goods. We already had the money, and that's the hard part. Luxury goods is something you can make if one of your buildings has the ability to do so, and at this late stage in the town, there's probably a building that can do it. So we just put somebody to work making them, and that's that. The only thing that can stop us now would be like running out of food or running out of fuel or something, and the town's economy collapsing, but it doesn't collapse. We've actually already done the goal in this clip, but I'm distracted. Looks like I want to take those routes there, and I'm so interested in taking them, I'm going to put down a warehouse right here to speed it up. Would also help with those farms nearby as well, I suppose. Obviously, I'm still in the economy production mode brain set, that thing that doesn't matter very much, and especially doesn't matter now. And I keep getting disappointed every time I realise I've been focusing on that, and then being like, oh, it didn't matter, because I enjoyed focusing on it, and then I suppose anti-enjoyed realising I'd wasted my time. Well, looks like we've done the thing eventually. So after completing 4 of the special orders, a bird comes along, seals the giant eye in the ground that was causing some problems, I suppose, and that's the end of that and the end of this town, and we get the rewards as normal. Got some nice achievements here, so that's good, including the Human Utopia achievement, which I noticed was super rare. So we've done it. We've been nicer to the humans than virtually all other players. Elect me as your ruler, humanity. I've done the simulation. I've got the rare achievement in Against the Storm, and like most politicians probably couldn't do that. Anyway, with that done, the cycle is forced to end because we did a seal event thing, and the next, now a bit longer cycle will begin. But of course, that means we are starting the game again. It fades to black, fades back up. Here it is. We're back at the start of Against the Storm. Want to do that again? Well, that's what the game proposes. We're going to buy my favourite upgrade, the one that gives you more gathering times and unlocks the beaver house permanently for that easier draw pile. And now, all of these are still to go. I was looking up the tree. There are so many to get, and they get more and more expensive as you go up. So essentially, we've played a certain amount. I'd played, I think it was 14 hours to get to this point. And I was thinking, it's going to take like 140 hours to go all the way up because it slows down as you go up, although playing on higher difficulty will increase the rewards quite a lot as well, and we certainly could do that because I was finding it pretty easy. I suppose I didn't necessarily want to find it more hard. I was fine just getting into my little groove and then being annoyed when the groove was pointless in the end. If the groove wasn't pointless in the end, would I have had more fun? I don't know, because maybe I wouldn't have got into the groove so much because it was too difficult. Hard to say, because I straight up didn't try, and I suppose that's the final comment to make in this video. I reached this point, and you can see me considering doing things, and since I bothered to go and take that upgrade, I was obviously thinking of going again, but I ultimately decided against it, and it was this sort of building feeling that I both wanted to play the game, but had gradually become overwhelmed by my negative impression of the game. Like, every time you start a new town, it's like, well, this again, huh? And once you've done it 10 times, or 11 times it was in this playthrough, it got to the point when I couldn't face another "oh, this again, huh?" I was just overcome by my fatigue at having to start the game again. I wonder if I played the game like too fast. My pace of play was I did roughly 1 town per day, just like every day continuously. So those 14 hours happened over 2 weeks. And I feel like that's not exactly binging the gameplay, so I don't want to say, well, it's because I played it too hard and fast, I got bored of it too fast. I don't know, I feel like I played it at a pretty respectable pace. But perhaps if you did it a couple of times a week, over like a year, that's more of the pace they were thinking of. I suppose they were trying to string players along throughout the early access and keep people playing it the whole time. And maybe that's why it takes a very long time to unlock all of the things. Not that you necessarily need to unlock all of the things, because another reason why I didn't necessarily want to play again is I felt like I'd seen it all, like I knew what was going to happen now. I actually know that isn't the case, because it does say somewhere that if you play on higher difficulties, there's a bunch of extra things that happen. There are buildings in your building pool that have no use, and I always thought it's weird that it gives you buildings that have no use. And it turns out it's because only at high difficulties do they have any use. There's some sort of rot or disease mechanic or something, I forget what it was now. There's some other problem you deal with alongside the usual economy stuff, but only on high difficulties. And I never saw what it was, because I got mad at the game before I reached that point. I suppose I never really wanted to play on higher difficulties, because I was having enough of a challenge on the middling difficulty, and then getting mad that it wasn't challenging enough on easy, but also being mad that I felt like the game was pushing me to play on easy for a different reason. Some kind of balancing concern there kept me out of not only the place I wanted to be, but the place where I would be to feel like I was getting better enough to go further into the difficulty tree and thus experience more content. So something about getting people off easy difficulty, weaning you off easy with more incentives, and having there be less of a gameplay advantage to playing on easy, I think might be a good idea. Well, anyway, that's going to be the end of Against the Storm and this quote-unquote complete commentary once again. I already gave my final thoughts. My final thought is basically, I quite like this game, but I'm not going to play it, which I feel like I've said for quite a lot of games over the course of this channel. It was an enjoyable time, but I found it less and less enjoyable as it went on, and I got the impression that I wasn't supposed to be finding it less and less enjoyable as it went along. So I just thought, well, I guess I'm doing this wrong in some way. I'm supposed to want to do this 100 more times, but I was done after 10 times. And it seems from the achievement data that most people actually feel that way as well. So maybe this is normal. I don't know. I'm trying to analyze it from a game design perspective. Like, what do the developers think the player's reaction to this design will be? That's always what I'm interested to know. And I'm interested in perhaps what you have to say about this as well, especially on the topic of it being a roguelike. Because as I've said a couple of times, I'm always in the camp where I just wish things weren't roguelikes, but other people don't seem to agree with that. So I don't know, we've got a game here where it's designed to be played a lot of times, but to me this is just diminishing returns, like you're not really getting anything if you keep playing it, but the developers fully intend for you to want to play it a huge number of times, and I wonder what did they think in their head was going to be the draw that keeps people playing it 100 times. I guess the answer would be just the gameplay, the fun of it, and I kind of get that, like I do find the game fun to play, it's just not fulfilling or rewarding enough because of this, well, the roguelikeness, because you take everything away constantly, everything always turns out not to have mattered very much. Both on the grand scale, like making a town doesn't matter very much in the universe of the lore, and on the micro scale where like optimizing your production lines doesn't matter very much because they just disappear and you'll probably complete the objectives without doing that as well, and I don't know, you can have your own fun trying to make your town really good, but there's no point. And I suppose if there was a point, it would feel more rewarding, other than the rewardingness I'm giving to myself, which, as I said, because I have brain rot, doesn't work. I need something exterior to reward me for playing the game. I can't find the game fun on its own merits, even though, when playing this game, I felt like that was happening to some extent. Something, if only it wasn't a roguelike. I think that's going to be my final review. I think we've got a really good game, held back by the fact that it's a really long and repetitive game by design, so you almost can't criticize it for that. It's supposed to be really long and repetitive, and you're supposed to like it like that. And I kind of did, but the fact that I knew it was just going to get worse and worse the longer I played, I thought, I guess I'm just going to stop. Pretty fair, I think, and judging by achievement data and things like that, that's probably what happens to most people. Most people don't seem to play especially far into the game, and I expect almost nobody has got, like, towards the end, so they're sort of adding early access content for the sake of this 1% of the player base that plays a lot of the game, which I suppose is fine. It's a roguelike, a game perfectly suited to having stuff that caters only to people who really played it heavily, because the people who really played it heavily are still getting basically the same experience as the new players, so you're not necessarily taking something away, other than the general fact that you took a lot away for it being a roguelike. Like, instead of there being some linear project to work through, it is a gameplay loop that is just the loop, it's just the start. Something, I'm going in circles myself. This video, interestingly, is like a roguelike, in that I keep saying the same thing over and over again, which is quite meta, quite artistic, I think, and only adds to the value of this video. Well, if you're one of the 1% of people who got this deep in the video, thank you for watching this commentary. A commentary on something else, potentially less harebrained, will be coming very soon. Thanks to Against the Storm for giving me a good enough time. I just wanted a better time, I suppose, and it felt like the game could have given me that if it was different. This is another case, by the way, I'll make this my actual final thought, where it feels like someone in the comments to this video will tell me how to have fun playing this game, that sort of thing. Like, they'll say, oh, if only you'd done this, you would have discovered this. Like, I remember having the same thing with Star Sector, that was the big one, where there were all sorts of things you could do in the game, and things that would have solved the big problems I had in the game, but they were of the type where it's, if only you'd done this, and like, you only learn about it too long after the experience for it to even matter anymore. Which I suppose is a comment unto itself. If you have something where you thought, but OffyD, you didn't do this, well, I will just put my mirror up and be like, yes, I didn't. And what does that say about a game where, like, I'm doing what the game's telling me to do? If I didn't do the thing that makes me want to play the game, should the game make me do the thing that makes me want to play the game? It's in the game's interest, I suppose. But, you know, in a meta sense, the developer already took the money, so I guess it's not really in their interest to do work to make the game more replayable in that sense. They've got pretty good reviews as it stands, so they clearly don't need to make it any better. But, you know, you ruined my life by 5% for 1 hour every day for 14 days Against the Storm, and I'm mad. Let's just go.